What if I told you that one of the most disturbing television shows ever made is actually perfect to fall asleep to? Yeah, I know that sounds completely backwards. The Boys, Amazon Prime's brutally honest superhero satire, just dropped its 4th season, and whether you've watched every episode wide awake or you're someone who loves drifting off to the sound of interesting facts and behind-the-scenes details, you are in exactly the right place tonight. So get comfortable, pull your blanket up, close your eyes if you want, and let me walk you through some of the most fascinating things about the Boys season for that even hardcore fans might not know. We're going deep on the creative choices, the real-world inspirations, the actor experiences, and the little details hidden in plain sight throughout the season. No jump scares, no sudden loud moments, just a calm and thorough journey through one of the most ambitious seasons of television in recent memory. The Boys Season 4 arrived on Prime Video in June of 2024, and from the very first episode it made clear that showrunner Eric Kripke and his team had no intention of pulling any punches. The season picks up in the aftermath of the events of Season 3, with the political and social landscape of the show's universe feeling more relevant and more uncomfortably close to our own reality than ever before. That sense of uncomfortable familiarity is something the creative team has always leaned into, but Season 4 took it to an entirely different level, drawing from headlines, political movements, and cultural anxieties in ways that sparked massive conversations online. One of the most talked about aspects of Season 4 was the character of Homelander, played with terrifying brilliance by Anthony Starr. What many viewers don't realize is how much physical and psychological preparation Anthony Starr puts into each season of this show. For Season 4, Starr has spoken in interviews about the challenge of portraying a character who is simultaneously becoming more unhinged and more powerful. The writing team gave Homelander storylines that pushed the character's narcissism and need for validation to completely new extremes, and Starr had to find ways to make those moments feel authentic rather than cartoonish. The result was a performance that earned enormous critical praise, with many reviewers calling it the best work Starr has done across the entire series. Now here is something genuinely interesting about how the show handles its villain. Kripke and the writers have been very open about the fact that Homelander is deliberately designed to mirror certain real-world figures without being a direct one-to-one copy of any specific person. The goal, as the creative team has explained it, is to capture something more universal about the psychology of unchecked power, about what happens when someone with enormous capabilities is never held accountable and is constantly surrounded by people who either fear them or worship them. That psychological portrait is researched carefully, and the writers have consulted materials on authoritarian personality types, cult dynamics, and the psychology of celebrity to shape how Homelander behaves in Season 4. Speaking of research, the production team for The Boys is known for doing extraordinary amounts of homework before every season. For Season 4, the writers' room reportedly spent months studying political movements, media manipulation tactics, and corporate lobbying practices to ensure the satirical elements of the show felt grounded and specific rather than vague. This is part of why the show resonates so deeply with audiences. It is not just throwing wild ideas at the wall. Every exaggerated moment in The Boys tends to have a real-world anchor point that makes it hit harder than pure fantasy ever could. Let us talk for a moment about the production design of Season 4, because it is genuinely remarkable and not enough people discuss it. The visual world of The Boys has always been meticulously constructed to feel like our world with the volume turned up slightly. In Season 4, the design team put enormous effort into the Vought Corporation's aesthetic, expanding and deepening the visual language of what is essentially the show's central villain organization. The way Vought spaces are designed tells you everything you need to know about how the corporation sees itself. Clean, powerful, aspirational. All chrome and glass and American flags. It is visual propaganda built into architecture, and the production designers made very deliberate choices about every space Vought characters inhabit. The Seven, Vaught's flagship superhero team, got some significant changes in Season 4, and the costume and makeup departments had their hands full keeping up with the evolving nature of each character. The superhero suits in The Boys are not spandex and foam rubber. They are incredibly intricate garments made from high-quality materials that have to be both visually impressive on camera and functional enough for the actors to actually move in. Each shoot reportedly takes weeks to construct and thousands of dollars worth of materials. When characters get new suit variations or when suits need to show damage and wear, the costume team essentially has to build entirely new pieces rather than simply modifying existing ones. Carl Urban, who plays Billy Butcher, had one of the most dramatically complex arcs of Season 4, and Urban has talked publicly about how much he enjoys the challenge this character presents. Butcher is a character defined by contradiction. He is brutal and manipulative and genuinely dangerous, but there is also something deeply wounded and human at his core, and Urban works hard to keep both of those things visible simultaneously. For Season 4 in particular, the writing gave Butcher storylines dealing with mortality and legacy that required Urban to bring genuine emotional weight to scenes that could easily have felt melodramatic in less skilled hands. It is the kind of writing and performance combination that elevates genre television into something that genuinely matters. Here is a detail many casual viewers miss. The Boys is actually an adaptation of a comic book series created by Garth Ennis and Derek Robertson, published by Wildstorm and later Dynamite Entertainment between 2006 and 2012. The show has always taken significant liberties with its source material, expanding, changing, and sometimes entirely reimagining characters and storylines. By Season 4, the television version has diverged so substantially from the comics that viewers who have read the original source material are often just as surprised by plot developments as those who have never picked up a single issue. This is a conscious choice by the showrunners, who wanted the series to be its own living thing rather than simply a faithful adaptation. The relationship between the comic and the show is actually a fascinating study in how source material can be honored in spirit while being radically transformed in execution. Garth Ennis, the original comics writer, has been publicly supportive of the television adaptation even though it takes the story in very different directions. Part of what makes this interesting is that Ennis himself was writing a satirical critique of superhero culture, corporate power, and American exceptionalism back in the mid-2000s, and Kripke's team has found ways to update those themes for a very different cultural moment while keeping the core provocative energy of the original work intact. Now let us drift into something a little more technical and perhaps more soothing to think about. The visual effects work on The Boys Season 4 is staggering in its scale and ambition. This is a show that requires hundreds of individual visual effects shots per episode, everything from the relatively simple removal of wires and harnesses when actors appear to be flying, to extraordinarily complex sequences involving superpowers being used in violent and creative ways. The VFX team on The Boys has grown substantially with each season as the show's ambitions have expanded, and Season 4 reportedly had one of the largest visual effects budgets of any streaming show in 2024. One of the most technically challenging aspects of the visual effects work involves scenes where multiple super-powered characters interact with each other and with environments simultaneously. Coordinating those sequences requires incredibly detailed pre-visualization work, where the entire sequence is essentially mapped out in a rough digital format before filming even begins. This previs process can take weeks or even months for particularly complex sequences, and it involves close collaboration between the directors, the stunt coordinators, the VFX supervisors, and the actors themselves. By the time a major action sequence actually gets filmed, everyone involved has essentially rehearsed it dozens of times in various forms. Erin Moriarty, who plays Annie January, also known as Starlight, has one of the most nuanced roles in Season 4. Her character has been on an extraordinary journey across the series, moving from naive idealism to hard-won cynicism to something more complicated and interesting than either of those things. Moriarty has spoken about the responsibility she feels toward this character, particularly because Annie resonates so strongly with young women in the audience who see their own experiences with disillusionment and resilience reflected in her story. Season forgave Moriarty material that explored new dimensions of Annie's character, and she has been clear in interviews that the collaborative atmosphere on set is a significant part of what makes those performances possible. The ensemble cast of The Boys is one of its greatest strengths, and Season 4 made excellent use of the established chemistry between these performers. Shows that have been running for multiple seasons sometimes struggle to keep ensemble dynamics feeling fresh, but The Boys has consistently managed to find new combinations of characters to put in scenes together, which keeps the interpersonal dynamics from going stale. Some of the most compelling moments in Season 4 come from unexpected pairings of characters who do not often share screen time, and those moments tend to generate some of the most memorable performances of the season. Let us talk about the music for a moment, because it is genuinely one of the show's secret weapons. The Boys has always had a masterful approach to music supervision, selecting needle drops that create ironic contrast between what is being shown on screen and what is being heard on the soundtrack. Season 4 continued this tradition with some genuinely inspired choices that viewers have endlessly discussed and debated online. The selection of songs is never random. Each piece of music is chosen to add a layer of commentary to whatever scene it accompanies, and the music supervisors work closely with the directors and the showrunner to ensure that the tonal balance between horror and dark comedy is maintained throughout. The original score of the show is also worth appreciating separately from the licensed music. The composer who works on The Boys has developed a distinctive sonic palette for the series over its run, and that score is subtler than the attention-grabbing needle drops but just as carefully crafted. The orchestral and electronic elements of the score work to create a sense of unease that runs beneath even the show's lighter moments, reminding viewers that this is fundamentally a dark world even when things appear to be going well for the characters. Here is something interesting about how Season 4 was written. The writer's room for The Boys is known for being a particularly creative and collaborative space, but it is also an intense one. Kripke has described the process of breaking stories for each season as involving enormous amounts of debate, with writers pushing each other to go further and be more specific in their critiques and their character work. For Season 4, some story ideas were apparently discussed for weeks before being either refined into something that made it to screen or set aside entirely. The ideas that get cut are often just as wild as the ones that end up in the show, which gives you some sense of the creative ambition at work in that room. The political satire in Season 4 was particularly pointed, and this generated a fascinating cultural phenomenon where people across the political spectrum simultaneously claimed the show was critiquing the other side. This is actually a testament to the sophistication of the writing. The show manages to create a funhouse mirror version of contemporary politics that reflects genuinely troubling dynamics in ways that feel recognizable without being so specifically partisan that they alienate half the audience immediately. Kripke has talked about this balance in numerous interviews, describing it as one of the ongoing creative challenges of making the show. Now, as you settle in and let your breathing slow down a little, let me tell you about the filming locations for Season 4. The Boys is primarily filmed in Toronto, Canada, which stands in for various American cities throughout the show's run. The production makes extensive use of Toronto's diverse architecture and neighborhoods, along with studio work at the city's major production facilities. For Season 4, the production reportedly used a wider variety of locations than previous seasons, partly to reflect the expanding scope of the story and partly to keep the visual experience of the show feeling fresh. Location scouts for a production like The Boys have an extraordinarily detailed job, finding spaces that can plausibly represent specific American settings while also being practical for filming. The stunt work in The Boys deserves its own dedicated appreciation. The stunt coordinators on this show are responsible for designing and executing some of the most creative and violent action sequences on television, and they do so while ensuring the safety of everyone involved. For Season 4, the stunt team developed several sequences that required entirely new approaches because the specific superpowers and situations involved had never been done before on the show. This is one of the ongoing creative challenges of working on a series with an ever-expanding set of superhuman abilities. Every new power essentially requires the stunt and visual effects teams to develop new techniques. Something that casual viewers might not appreciate is how much rehearsal time goes into even relatively brief action scenes. A sequence that takes up 30 seconds of screen time might represent multiple full days of rehearsal and filming. The actors who perform their own stunts in those sequences, and several of the main cast members do quite a bit of their own stunt work, spend considerable time working with the stunt coordinators to ensure that the movements feel authentic and that they can be executed safely at the required intensity. This collaborative process between actors and stunt professionals is one of the less glamorous but genuinely fascinating aspects of how a show like this gets made. Let us take a quiet moment and think about the writing of individual episodes in Season 4. Each episode of The Boys is a complex piece of work that has to balance multiple storylines, advance character development, deliver on the show's satirical agenda, and satisfy the entertainment expectations of a very engaged and demanding audience. The writers who work on individual episodes bring different strengths to the table, and the variation in tone between episodes is often a reflection of which writer or writing team took the lead on a particular installment. Some episodes lean harder into the dark comedy, others into the horror elements, and still others prioritize emotional character work. The skill of the showrunner lies in making all of those variations feel like part of a coherent whole. The directors of Season 4 came from a variety of backgrounds, and bringing in different directorial perspectives is a deliberate strategy on prestige television productions like this one. Each director brings their own visual sensibility and interpretive approach to the material, while working within the established look and feel of the show. The challenge for directors joining an ongoing series is understanding and honoring what has come before while also bringing something genuinely fresh to their episodes. The Boys has been successful at this balancing act because the showrunners are very clear about the fundamental visual and tonal rules of the series, while also giving directors meaningful creative latitude within those parameters. One of the most discussed aspects of Season 4 was its exploration of found family dynamics and the way that trauma shapes bonds between people. The core group of characters around Billy Butcher has always functioned as a kind of broken family, people who have been hurt by the world in specific ways and who have found each other partly out of necessity and partly out of something more genuine. Season 4 pushed these dynamics in new directions, testing the bonds between characters in ways that felt emotionally authentic rather than contrived. This is the kind of emotional work that separates shows that are merely entertaining from shows that leave a lasting impression on audiences. The casting of guest and recurring characters in Season 4 was handled with particular care. The show has always made excellent use of its supporting cast, and Season 4 introduced some new characters who were received warmly by audiences and critics alike. The casting process for a show like The Boys involves finding actors who can match the very specific energy the series requires, which is a delicate combination of dramatic capability, comedic timing, physical presence, and the willingness to commit fully to material that can be quite extreme. The casting directors who work on the show have developed a strong sense of what The Boys needs from its performers, and that institutional knowledge shows in the consistency of the casting quality. Here is a softer detail to think about as you drift. Many of the props used throughout Season 4 contain hidden details and jokes that are invisible at normal viewing distance, and often only caught by audience members who pause their screens or watch extremely carefully. The production design team puts enormous effort into creating a fully realized fictional world, and that includes populating that world with fake advertisements, fake news broadcasts, fake social media posts, and fake product packaging that all contain jokes and Easter eggs. Some of these details reference previous events in the show's history, others are pure jokes for their own sake, and finding them has become a beloved activity for the show's most dedicated fan community. The fan community around The Boys is itself a fascinating cultural phenomenon worth thinking about. The show has generated one of the most active and creative fan communities in contemporary streaming television, with fans producing art, fan fiction, analysis essays, video essays, and detailed annotation of each episode that sometimes reveals details the creators themselves had forgotten including. The relationship between the show and its fan community has been notably warm, with Kripke and many of the cast members being quite active on social media and engaging with fan responses to episodes. This kind of creator-to-audience dialogue has become more common in the streaming era, but The Boys has made it particularly central to how the show exists in the culture. Season 4 dealt extensively with themes of legacy, specifically the question of what people leave behind and whether any individual action can meaningfully change large structural problems. These philosophical questions are embedded in the plot and character work, but they are never stated explicitly. Instead, they emerge from the specific situations the characters find themselves in and the choices they make under pressure. This is sophisticated thematic writing, and it is part of why the show is taken seriously as social commentary rather than dismissed as simply extreme content for shock value. The balance between extreme content and genuine emotional depth is one of the defining creative achievements of The Boys as a series. The show contains material that is genuinely difficult to watch, scenes of violence and cruelty that are designed to be disturbing rather than exciting. But those moments are always placed in a context that gives them meaning, that connects them to the larger arguments the show is making about power and accountability and human nature. The writers have been clear that they do not include extreme content for its own sake, but rather to make points that gentler storytelling could not make as effectively. Whether viewers agree with those creative choices is a matter of personal taste, but the intentionality behind them is not really in question. Now let us settle even further into something quieter. Think about the editing of Season 4, which is a craft that operates largely invisibly when it is working correctly. The editors on The Boys are responsible for assembling the footage from multiple filming days into coherent scenes, then assembling those scenes into episodes, and working closely with the showrunner and directors to ensure that pacing, tone, and emphasis are all hitting the intended targets. Season 4 reportedly went through significant editing work in post-production, with some sequences being substantially reworked based on early screenings and feedback. This kind of iterative editing process is common on prestige television, and the willingness to keep refining material until it works is part of what distinguishes these productions from lower-budget work. The sound design of The Boys is another element that rarely gets the appreciation it deserves. The sound team is responsible for creating an immersive audio environment that makes the superhero violence feel real and grounded rather than cartoonish. This involves creating original sound effects for things that have no real-world equivalent, things like specific superpowers being used in specific ways. The sound designers draw from enormous libraries of recorded sounds and combine and transform them to create new sonic textures. Season 4 had some particularly impressive sound design moments, where the audio work was doing as much emotional work as the visuals. One thing that has been noted by critics and viewers alike about Season 4 is how well it developed its female characters in particular. The show has always taken the experiences of its female characters seriously, using their storylines to examine specific forms of power imbalance and exploitation that are distinct from what the male characters face. Season 4 expanded on this, giving characters like Starlight, Kimiko, and others material that felt both specific to their established personalities and genuinely surprising in its emotional depth. The writers who worked most closely on these character arcs have spoken about doing deliberate research to ensure these storylines felt authentic rather than exploitative. The character of Kimiko, played by Karen Fukuhara, has one of the show's most distinctive communication challenges because the character does not speak. All of Kimiko's emotional expression has to come through physical performance and context, which is a genuinely difficult acting challenge that Fukuhara handles with remarkable skill. Season forgave Fukuhara material that expanded the emotional range of this character in ways that were visually inventive and emotionally resonant, and the work she does is consistently cited by critics as one of the show's underappreciated strengths. Let the thoughts drift a little now, like leaves moving slow across water. The Boys is a show that asks its audience to sit with discomfort, to recognize things about the world we live in reflected in its distorted mirror, and to keep watching even when what is being shown is not pleasant. That is a challenging proposition, and the fact that millions of people have accepted that invitation season after season speaks to something real about the quality and the relevance of the work. Season 4 deepened that relationship with its audience, delivering a season that was darker and more emotionally ambitious than its predecessors while never losing the irreverent energy that made the show compelling in the first place. There is something worth appreciating about how long-form television storytelling works at its best. Characters in a series like The Boys develop over years of audience time, and the cumulative emotional weight of that development means that moments in Season 4 land with a force that would be impossible to achieve without everything that came before. When a character makes a choice that reflects who they have become over 4 seasons of story, the impact of that moment is multiplied by all of the history the audience brings to it. This is the specific gift of serialized storytelling, and The Boys uses it with genuine sophistication. As you settle deeper and the words become more like soft sounds than things you have to actively process, consider this. The people who make The Boys, the writers and directors and actors and designers and visual effects artists and editors and everyone else in the enormous collaborative enterprise that produces a season of television are doing work that they clearly care about deeply. The ambition and craft on display in Season 4 is not the product of cynical commercial calculation alone. There is genuine artistic investment in the show, a belief that it matters, that what it says about power and accountability and human nature is worth saying, and worth saying well. The Boys Season 4 is not perfect television. No season of any show is. But it is television that takes its audience seriously, that trusts viewers to engage with complex material and to follow character arcs through genuine darkness towards something that feels, if not exactly hopeful, then at least honest about the world. That combination of entertainment and purpose is rarer than it should be, and when it works, it is worth appreciating. So let those thoughts settle now. The Vought Towers gleaming in the fictional skyline. The complicated people doing complicated things in a world that feels uncomfortably familiar. The enormous craft and effort that goes into every frame. All of it can rest quietly at the edges of awareness now as your breathing slows and the night gets quieter around you. The boys will be there when you wake up, ready to be watched with full attention. But for now, let the facts and the details and the appreciation for good work done carefully drift you gently towards sleep. Season 4 delivered. The people who made it cared. And that is a comforting thought to carry into rest. Let me tell you something that most people who claim to be die-hard fans of The Boys completely get wrong. They think they know everything about this show. They've seen every season. They've got the merch. They can quote every line. But I'm about to share things about The Boys that will genuinely make you question how well you actually know this universe. Stay with me because some of these are going to hit different than you expect. The Boys is one of those rare properties that exists on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, it looks like a superhero deconstruction story. But underneath that, there's a decades-long journey that started in a completely different medium, shaped by real-world frustrations, industry chaos, and creative decisions that nearly never happened. And the more you dig into that history, the more fascinating the whole thing becomes. So let's start from the very beginning because even the origin of this story has a fact buried in it that most fans completely overlook. Garth Ennis, the writer behind The Boys, actually created the comic series back in 2006. But here's what a lot of people don't realize. The comic was originally published by DC Comics under their Wildstorm imprint. It wasn't an independent project from the start. DC actually dropped the series after just 6 issues because the content was considered too extreme even by their standards. Think about that for a second. A company that has published some of the most violent and disturbing comics in the mainstream market looked at The Boys and said, "You know what? This is actually too much." That is a statement in itself. After DC dropped it, the series was picked up by Dynamite Entertainment, where it ran for its full 60 issues and became the complete story we now know. So the very existence of The Boys as a finished work is partly thanks to a publisher willing to let Ennis go where he wanted to go without interference. That creative freedom is baked into the DNA of the source material, and you can feel it in the tone of everything that followed. Now let's talk about the show itself because the journey from comic page to streaming platform was anything but smooth. The Boys television series was actually developed first for the American Broadcast Network. It was originally set up at Cinemax, which is an HBO subsidiary. The show was being built for that platform when Amazon Studios stepped in and acquired it. That transition happened in 2018 when Amazon picked up the show and immediately ordered it straight to series. No pilot, no development limbo. They saw what the creative team was building and committed to it right away. That kind of confidence from a streamer is rare, and it changed the trajectory of the show entirely because Amazon gave the creative team the freedom and the budget to go places that a traditional network never would have allowed. Eric Kripke, who most people know as the creator of Supernatural, was the showrunner brought in to adapt the material. And this is where it gets interesting because Kripke had actually been trying to develop The Boys for television for years before it finally happened. His persistence with this particular property is part of why the show has such a clear and consistent vision. This wasn't a project handed to him. He fought to make it exist. Let's talk about casting because there are some genuinely surprising stories here that most casual fans have never heard. Carl Urban, who plays Billy Butcher, one of the most iconic characters in the show, almost didn't take the role. According to what he has shared in interviews, he was initially uncertain about committing to a television series because he had primarily built his career in film. Urban had done major blockbuster franchises including Star Trek and Lord of the Rings. The idea of transitioning to a streaming series was a bigger mental shift than people might assume. What ultimately convinced him was the quality of the writing and the character himself. Billy Butcher is genuinely one of the most complex anti-heroes in modern television, and Urban recognized that. The rest is history, obviously, but that near miss is worth sitting with. Now here is something that surprises people when they find out. Anthony Starr, the actor who plays Homelander, the main antagonist of the series, is actually from New Zealand. His natural accent is nothing like the all-American voice he uses for the character. Starr has spoken about how he actually spent significant time developing the specific Midwestern American quality to Homelander's speech, understanding that the voice was as important as the physicality of the character. The way Homelander speaks is part of what makes him feel simultaneously approachable and deeply threatening. That contrast is entirely intentional, and Starr engineered it deliberately. What's even more interesting about Starr's portrayal is something he has described in interviews about his approach to the character. He doesn't play Homelander as a villain. He plays him as a person who genuinely believes he deserves everything he demands. That distinction completely changes how the performance lands. When you watch Homelander have a breakdown, it doesn't feel like a supervillain losing control. It feels like a deeply damaged person who never developed emotional regulation because no one ever held him accountable for anything. That psychological specificity is what elevates the performance from impressive to genuinely disturbing. Let's keep going because we are just getting started, and the production side of this show has details that are absolutely wild. The cape and costume design for the Seven, the show's superhero team, went through extensive development processes that most viewers never think about. Each costume was designed to simultaneously feel like a genuine superhero outfit and also carry an element of corporate branding. The design team actually studied real-world sports team uniforms and celebrity branding campaigns when developing the looks for the Seven because within the world of the show, these are essentially brand ambassadors as much as they are heroes. Every detail, including the colors, the materials, and the logo placement, was informed by marketing research. That level of world-building detail in the costume department is genuinely impressive. Here's something wild about the production that actually affects how you watch the show. The flying sequences for Homelander were among the most technically challenging shots in the series. The production team used a combination of practical wire work, green screen technology, and digital effects that have evolved significantly across the seasons. In the earlier episodes, the team was still developing the methodology, and there are subtle differences in how flight looks compared to the later seasons. Once you know this, you start noticing the visual refinements as the show progressed. Now let's shift to something that gets into the deeper meaning of the show, because this is where it genuinely gets fascinating. Eric Kripke has been remarkably transparent in interviews about the political and social commentary embedded throughout The Boys. The show uses superheroes as a stand-in for unchecked corporate power, celebrity culture, and the gap between public image and private behavior. Kripke has specifically discussed how Vought International, the corporation that controls the Seven and essentially owns the superhero narrative in the show's world, was modeled after real media and entertainment corporations. The idea was to examine what happens when the entities that are supposed to protect people are more invested in protecting their own brand and revenue streams than in actually doing right by the public. What makes this commentary so effective is that it doesn't preach. The show trusts the audience to draw their own conclusions. The satirical elements are embedded in the story rather than delivered as lectures, and that's a delicate balance to maintain across multiple seasons and dozens of episodes. Now here is a fact that blows people's minds when they find out about it. The show has an internal Bible, a detailed document that outlines the world's rules, the history of Compound V, the corporate structure of Vought, and the backstories of every major superhero in the universe. This document is reportedly extraordinarily detailed, running to hundreds of pages. Kripke and the writers' room worked on this before a single episode was filmed because they understood that the satirical world they were building needed internal consistency to land its punches effectively. When a show's universe feels real, the commentary embedded in it hits harder. That investment in world building paid off. Let's talk about Compound V for a second, because the show's mythology around how people become superheroes is actually one of its most clever inversions of the genre. In most superhero stories, powers are either innate, the result of accident, or achieved through extraordinary circumstances. In the boys' universe, Compound V is a manufactured product. It's a drug. And the implications of that distinction ripple through everything. Superpowers become something that can be created, sold, weaponized, and controlled by whoever holds the patent. Vought doesn't just manage superheroes. They manufacture them, which means every superhero in this world is also a product. That's not just dark. It's genuinely unsettling in a way that feels uncomfortably relevant to conversations about pharmaceutical influence and corporate ownership of biological processes. The show has leaned into this mythology more deeply in each season, expanding the lore around Compound V and exploring what it means that something presented to the public as miraculous and natural is actually a corporate invention with a very specific and troubling history. Now let's get into some behind-the-scenes facts that are a little more personal and surprising. Jack Quaid, who plays Huey Campbell, the audience's entry point into the show's world, is the son of actors Dennis Quaid and Meg Ryan. This is something people sometimes know, but what's less discussed is how deliberately Jack Quaid brings a sense of genuine relatability and vulnerability to Huey that is completely essential to how the show functions. Huey is not a cool character. He's not powerful, not intimidating, not particularly competent in the early going. He's the person in an extraordinary situation who doesn't really know what he's doing, and that's intentional. Having an everyman center character in a show this extreme gives viewers a consistent emotional anchor. Quaid's ability to make that character feel authentic rather than simply naive is underappreciated. There's also something worth noting about the dynamic between Jack Quaid and Carl Urban on set, which both actors have spoken about positively. Their characters have a fundamentally difficult relationship, full of tension and conflict, but the two actors developed a genuine working rapport that helps sell the complicated dynamic between Butcher and Huey. Sometimes the best on-screen chemistry comes from off-screen professional respect, and that appears to be exactly what happened here. Let's talk about Erin Moriarty, who plays Annie January, also known as Starlight. Her arc across the series is one of the most emotionally substantial journeys in the whole show. But here's something about her character's development that speaks to how the writers approach their source material. In the original comic, Annie's character goes through extremely dark material that Moriarty and the showrunners chose to handle very differently in the adaptation. The television version of Starlight is more fully developed as a complete person with agency and a genuine moral perspective. The show took what was in the source material and built something more nuanced around it, which is a choice that not all adaptations make successfully. The fact that Starlight feels like one of the most grounded and real characters in a show full of extreme personalities is a testament to both the writing and Moriarty's performance. Now I want to spend a moment on Tomer Capone, who plays Frenchie, because his background is fascinating. Capone is an Israeli actor, and Frenchie is one of those characters who could easily have become a caricature. The European accent, the eccentric personality, the particular set of skills. In lesser hands with lesser writing, it could have been a one-note character. Instead, Frenchie is consistently one of the most emotionally affecting characters in the show. Capone brings a warmth and a genuine humanity to scenes that balance the show's more brutal elements. His chemistry with Karen Fukuhara, who plays Kamiko, created one of the most beloved relationships in the entire series. Speaking of Fukuhara, here's something genuinely impressive about her work on the show. Kamiko is a character who does not speak for much of the series. She communicates through expression, physicality, and eventually sign language. Playing a character without conventional dialogue is an extraordinary acting challenge, and Fukuhara makes Kamiko one of the most expressive and emotionally readable characters in the whole cast. That's not an accident. It reflects both her skill and deliberate choices about how to tell a story without words. Here's something about the show's music that most people haven't thought about. The soundtrack and score of The Boys is part of how the show weaponizes familiarity. Music you associate with comfort, patriotism, and heroism gets used in contexts that make those associations deeply uncomfortable. This is a deliberate strategy. When you hear something that sounds like an inspiring superhero theme underscoring something genuinely terrible, the cognitive dissonance creates a specific kind of unease that pure horror or drama can't achieve. The music team understood that they weren't just scoring scenes. They were participating in the show's satirical project. The show has also made extensive use of pop songs in ways that create jarring contrast. A bright, upbeat popular song playing over a scene of violence or corporate manipulation doesn't feel random. It feels like a comment on how culture packages darkness with palatable surfaces. Once you notice this pattern in the show, you can't stop noticing it. Let's get into some facts about the show's viewership and cultural impact because the numbers here are remarkable. When The Boys premiered on Amazon Prime Video in July 2019, it immediately became one of the most watched original series on the platform. But what happened between the first and second seasons is interesting. The gap between Season 1 and Season 2 saw the show's cultural footprint grow enormously, partly because audiences had time to discover it during streaming, share it with friends, and build the kind of word-of-mouth momentum that streaming shows often struggle to generate in real time. By the time Season 2 arrived, the show had become a genuine cultural phenomenon. The second season also benefited from the specific moment in which it landed. It arrived in late 2020, during an incredibly charged political and social period, and the show's themes about power, corruption, media manipulation, and the danger of charismatic authority felt almost uncomfortably timely. Kripke and the writers have talked about how they sometimes felt like they were writing satire and reality was trying to keep pace with them, which is not a comfortable position for a showrunner to be in. Now here is a fact about the show's production that speaks to the sheer scale of what they built. The show films primarily in Toronto, Canada, which stands in for the fictional Vought-controlled American city where much of the action takes place. The production design team does extraordinary work making Toronto look and feel like an American corporate environment, but there are subtle moments where the Canadian setting peeks through if you know what to look for. The production has spoken about this as both a practical challenge and a creative puzzle. Making a show that is fundamentally about American cultural pathologies while filming in Canada requires a specific kind of deliberate production design that the team has pulled off impressively well. Let's circle back to something deeper because I want to make sure we cover the aspects of this show that go beyond fun production trivia and get into why it actually matters. The Boys is genuinely unique in how it handles the question of power and accountability. Most superhero stories, even the ones that try to be dark or subversive, ultimately affirm the idea that there are good people in positions of extraordinary power and those good people will use that power responsibly. The Boys rejects this premise almost entirely. In the world of the show, the existence of unchecked power is itself the problem, regardless of who holds it. Even the most sympathetic characters in positions of power make choices that compromise their principles because the systems around them reward compromise and punish integrity. This is a genuinely radical position for a mainstream entertainment property to take and hold consistently across multiple seasons. It's one of the reasons the show generates the kind of passionate engagement it does. It's not just entertaining. It's making an argument. And whether you agree with that argument or not, the clarity of the show's moral vision is part of what makes it so compelling. Here is a behind-the-scenes fact that might genuinely surprise you. The showroom for The Boys apparently operates with an unusually open process for pitching story ideas. Writers at various levels of experience and seniority have reportedly been encouraged to bring their most extreme and unexpected ideas to the table, with the understanding that the show's premise creates space for almost any kind of social commentary if it's handled with craft. This kind of creative culture is relatively rare in television production, where hierarchy and creative gatekeeping are common. The result is a show that consistently surprises its audience because the writers themselves are encouraged to surprise each other. The spin-off series Gen V, which focuses on college-age superheroes in training at a Vought-funded university, came directly out of this creative expansion. The Boys universe is large enough and coherent enough internally that it could support an entirely separate show with its own tone and set of concerns. Gen V leaned more heavily into horror and the specific anxieties of younger generations navigating a world shaped by forces beyond their control, and it worked because the world-building foundation was solid enough to support it. Let me share something about how the show approaches its most extreme content, because this is actually important context that changes how you might think about certain scenes. The most graphic and disturbing moments in The Boys are not included for shock value alone. This is something Kripke has addressed directly. The show operates on a principle that extreme content has to carry thematic weight. When something viscerally uncomfortable happens on screen, it's supposed to make you feel something specific about power, about entitlement, about the ways institutions protect people who should face consequences. The discomfort is functional. It's designed to make you sit with something that polished storytelling would let you look away from. This doesn't mean every viewer will appreciate the approach. The show is genuinely not for everyone, and that's by design. But understanding that the most extreme moments are intentional and structured rather than random helps clarify what the show is actually doing. Here's a fact about Homelander specifically that I find endlessly fascinating. The character was deliberately designed to evoke a very specific type of American mythology. He looks like the idealized version of a patriotic hero, blonde, square-jawed, wearing the colors of the American flag. Everything about his visual presentation is designed to trigger associations with heroism, safety, and American exceptionalism. The show then systematically dismantles those associations by showing you who Homelander actually is beneath the image. The visual design is essentially a trap that the show sets for the audience, using the instinctive comfort we feel around those symbols against us. Anthony Starr has described understanding this function of the character as central to how he plays him. Homelander has to be genuinely appealing in certain moments, because if he was simply repulsive from the start, the critique wouldn't land. The danger of people like Homelander is precisely that they are compelling. That's the whole point. Now let me give you something that connects the show back to its comic roots in an interesting way. Garth Ennis, the original comic writer, has spoken about his mixed feelings regarding the television adaptation. He has been generally positive about the show's existence and its success, but he has also noted that the television version makes different choices than he would have made, particularly in terms of which characters receive sympathetic treatment and which storylines get expanded or compressed. This is normal for adaptations, but Ennis's perspective is interesting because it highlights just how much the television version is its own creative work rather than a faithful translation of the source material. The show has genuinely gone beyond the comics in terms of runtime and story development. With multiple seasons running to many episodes each, the television version has explored characters and storylines that the comics either handled briefly or didn't develop at all. In some ways, the show has created a more expansive version of this world than even the original creator envisioned, which is a remarkable thing to happen in an adaptation. Let's talk about the international dimensions of this show's success, because they're genuinely impressive. The Boys became one of the first Amazon original series to achieve truly global viewership numbers that competed with the largest streaming hits from any platform. The show found audiences in markets where superhero content had previously been dominated by the major Hollywood franchises, and in many of those markets the show's critique of American corporate and cultural power actually resonated in ways that were distinct from how American audiences engaged with it. Watching a show that deconstructs American cultural mythology from outside that culture hits differently, and that international engagement says something meaningful about the show's reach. Here is one more production fact that I think deserves attention. The stunt work on The Boys is extraordinary and largely underappreciated. The show features incredibly complex action sequences that involve practical stunt work combined with digital enhancement, and the stunt performers who execute these sequences operate under extraordinary pressure given the show's visual demands. Several of the show's regular cast members have done significant amounts of their own stunt work in order to maintain the visual continuity of action sequences. Carl Urban in particular has spoken about the physical demands of playing Butcher across multiple seasons, and how the action sequences have evolved in complexity as the show's budget and ambitions have grown. The fight choreography also carries thematic meaning in the show. The way the Boys fight compared to the way the Seven operate in combat reflects the power imbalance at the core of the show's premise. Normal humans against superhumans require completely different tactical approaches, and the choreography team developed a specific language for how each group fights that reinforces the show's underlying dynamics. Now here's something to consider as we come toward the end of this, and it connects everything we've been talking about. The Boys works because it takes its premise completely seriously. It doesn't wink at the audience. It doesn't soften its most uncomfortable implications. It commits to the internal logic of a world where corporate power has captured the function of heroism itself and asks what that world actually looks like for the people living in it. And the answer it gives is messy, painful, frequently darkly funny, and ultimately more honest than the polished fantasy of most superhero entertainment. The facts we've covered today, from the comic's troubled origins to the casting near misses, from the deliberate costume design to the thematic architecture of the score, from the political timing of the show's biggest seasons to the psychological specificity of the performances, all of these details point toward the same conclusion. The Boys is not an accident. Every element of it is the result of deliberate creative choices made by people who understood exactly what they were trying to do and fought to do it without compromise. That's what separates it from shows that simply try to be edgy or provocative. Edge without purpose is just noise. The Boys has always known what it's saying and why it needs to say it that way. That's why years after its premiere, it still generates conversation, debate, and passionate engagement from its audience. It earns that engagement by respecting the audience enough to never simplify its own argument. So the next time you watch an episode and something makes you deeply uncomfortable, sit with that feeling instead of immediately reaching for the remote. The discomfort is the point. The show is doing exactly what it set out to do. And knowing the history and intention behind it doesn't make it less impactful. It actually makes it more. If you've made it this far and there's a fact in here that genuinely surprised you or changed how you think about the show, drop it in the comments. I want to know which one hit different for you. And if you want more deep dives like this one into the shows and properties that actually have layers worth exploring, make sure you're subscribed because there is a lot more coming. See you in the next one. Look, I've been watching superhero content for years. I've sat through every Marvel phase, every DC reboot, every streaming disaster. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, has grabbed me by the throat and refused to let go quite like The Boys. And here's the thing that keeps me up at night. Most people think they know this show. They've watched it. They've talked about it. They've argued about it online. But I promise you, by the time this video ends, you're going to realize you barely scratched the surface of what's actually going on beneath the layers of blood, satire, and absolute chaos that makes this show one of the most brilliant pieces of television ever created. So stay with me, because some of what I'm about to tell you is going to change how you watch every single episode again. Let's start with something that sounds simple but is actually one of the most deliberately crafted decisions the show has ever made. The name Vought International is not random. The creators drew inspiration from real defense contractors and entertainment conglomerates to build a company that feels disturbingly familiar. Vought is essentially a composite nightmare of every major corporation you've ever had a complicated relationship with. It sells the idea of superheroes the same way a fast food chain sells the idea of happiness. The product looks amazing in the marketing. The reality is something entirely different. And that deliberate parallel to modern corporate America is baked into every single logo placement, every press conference, every smile Homelander flashes for the cameras. Now here's where things get really interesting. Karl Urban, the man who plays Billy Butcher, one of the most beloved characters in the entire show, almost didn't take the role. He had serious reservations. Not because he didn't love the character, but because he wasn't sure the show could actually pull off what it was attempting to do. The source material, the original comic series written by Garth Ennis, is genuinely extreme. We are talking about content that makes even the most shocking moments in the show look like a warm-up. Urban needed to be convinced that the television adaptation would find the right balance between being genuinely provocative and being gratuitous for no reason. Once the showrunner Eric Kripke got him on the phone and laid out the vision, Urban was in. And if you've ever watched Urban in an interview talking about Butcher, you can see that he didn't just take a job. He took on an identity. Speaking of Karl Urban, did you know that his accent in the show required more preparation than almost any other aspect of his performance? Urban is from New Zealand. Billy Butcher is from London's East End. Those are not remotely similar sounds. Urban worked with dialect coaches for an extended period before filming began, and he has spoken in interviews about how he essentially had to rebuild the way he physically forms words to make Butcher sound authentic. What's fascinating is that the accent itself becomes a character. There's a roughness to it, a working-class aggression that tells you everything about where Butcher came from before you even learn his backstory. That's not accident. That's craft. But let's talk about the character who arguably carries the most psychological weight in the entire show. Homelander. Played with terrifying precision by Anthony Starr, a New Zealand actor who, much like Urban, had to completely shed his natural voice and presence to inhabit this role. What most people don't realize is that Homelander was specifically designed to be a deconstruction of Superman, but not the cynical kind of deconstruction that just makes a hero evil for shock value. The writers wanted to ask a genuinely disturbing question. What would a person actually be like if they grew up with those abilities, in that kind of isolation, subjected to that kind of experimental pressure from birth, with no normal human development, no genuine love, no real sense of consequence? The answer they arrived at is Homelander. And it's horrifying because it makes sense. Anthony Starr has talked extensively about the preparation that went into Homelander psychology. He based elements of the character on research into narcissistic personality disorder, abandonment trauma, and the specific psychological profiles of cult leaders. That smile that Homelander does, the one that sends chills down your spine even when he's supposed to be doing something heroic, that was developed intentionally. Starr described it as the smile of someone who has learned that smiling gets you what you want, but who doesn't actually feel what the smile is supposed to represent. It's a mask that occasionally slips. And when it slips, that's when you see what's underneath. And what's underneath is something that didn't get enough of the right things when it needed the most. Now let me tell you something that genuinely blew my mind when I first came across it. The show films primarily in Toronto, Canada, but the production design team works overtime to make it feel like various American cities. The reason Toronto is used is partly financial, because Canadian production incentives make large-scale television significantly cheaper to produce, but also because the city's architecture is versatile enough to double for multiple American locations with the right dressing. What's remarkable is how successfully this works. The Vought Tower, the streets, the neighborhoods, all of it has been built, dressed, and filtered to feel distinctly American in its visual language. It's a deliberate construction of a place that represents America without actually being America. Which, when you think about the show's themes around image versus reality, feels oddly appropriate. Let's get into the comic books for a second, because the relationship between the source material and the show is one of the most fascinating production stories in recent television history. Garth Ennis wrote the original boys comic series starting in 2006. He created it as a genuinely angry, frequently grotesque response to what he saw as the sanitization of superhero stories and the cultural moment of the mid-2000s. The comic does not hold back. In ways that would be essentially impossible to put directly on a streaming platform, it goes to places that are designed to make you uncomfortable on a fundamental level. When Amazon picked up the adaptation, the challenge was enormous. How do you take source material that operates at a kind of creative extreme and translate it into something that keeps the spirit, keeps the rage, keeps the satire, but also functions as prestige television that can reach a mainstream audience? Eric Kripke's answer was to treat the comic as a starting point rather than a blueprint. Significant characters were reconceived. Story arcs were restructured. Tonal adjustments were made that changed some aspects dramatically. And in many cases, the show actually deepens the ideas that the comic introduced by giving them more space to breathe and more contemporary cultural targets to aim at. The result is something that longtime comic readers often find surprising, not because the show is worse, but because it becomes its own thing with its own logic and its own distinct personality. One specific example that's worth mentioning is the character of Starlight, played by Erin Moriarty. In the comics, Starlight's arc is significant but differs in some important structural ways from what the show does with her. The television version of Starlight transforms into something much more central and much more emotionally resonant than her comic counterpart. She becomes the show's moral compass in a way that gives the audience someone to orient around, someone whose perspective shifts alongside theirs as the world of Vought is slowly revealed to be exactly as corrupt as the most cynical person in the room always suspected. Moriarty herself has spoken about how the character evolved significantly through the writing process, and that she had ongoing conversations with the writers about who Annie January really is beneath the superhero identity. Here's a detail that a lot of viewers miss entirely. The Seven, the elite superhero team at the center of the show, is deliberately structured to parallel the Justice League in ways that go beyond just the obvious Homelander and Superman comparison. Each member maps onto a DC icon in a way that then exposes something specific about that archetype. The Deep has elements that parallel Aquaman, complete with the complicated relationship to an underwater identity that the character is made to feel embarrassed about. Queen Maeve has Wonder Woman energy, a warrior with ancient strength who has been so thoroughly compromised by corporate machinery that she can barely remember who she was before Vought got their hands on her. A-Train has a Flash parallel, a speedster whose entire identity has been consumed by the performance of being a speedster, to the point where the performance and the person have become almost indistinguishable. By setting up these parallels, the show can then systematically interrogate every assumption that the original archetypes carry with them. What does Aquaman look like when the idea of being a sea-based hero is turned into a branding opportunity? What does Wonder Woman look like after decades of being told by men in suits how to present herself to a public that will never fully understand her? The answers are uncomfortable because they're meant to be. Now let's talk about the production side for a moment, because the practical effects work on this show deserves way more recognition than it typically gets. The Boys is famous for its shocking visual moments. The whale scene, the first episode's ending, various other sequences that viewers tend to describe in hushed, slightly traumatized tones to people who haven't seen the show yet. What most people don't realize is how much of this is achieved through a combination of practical effects and digital work that is genuinely innovative. The effects teams have won industry recognition for their work precisely because the challenge is so unusual. Most visual effects work is about making something fantastical look real. On The Boys, the challenge is often making something real look even more viscerally present than it would naturally feel. The goal isn't seamless integration. The goal is impact. The exploding heads, a recurring motif in the show, require careful coordination between the practical effects department and the digital team. The initial physics of the event is often done practically, with rigs and materials that create a genuinely physical result, and then that physical result is extended and enhanced digitally to reach the precise level of visual intensity the scene requires. It sounds technical, and it is, but the reason it matters is because you can feel it. There's a texture to the show's violence that CGI alone could never achieve, and that texture is what makes the show's horror land with such force. Let me shift to something a little more unexpected. The music supervision on The Boys is doing something genuinely clever that I think flies under the radar for a lot of viewers. The song choices in this show are not just atmosphere or tone setting. They are editorial commentary. When you hear a specific piece of music playing over a specific scene, the show is often doing something deliberately ironic or confrontational, using the cultural associations of the song to create a third layer of meaning that exists between the scene's surface narrative and its emotional subtext. The most famous example might be the use of an upbeat, familiar piece of music playing over something deeply disturbing. The contrast creates a specific emotional texture that the show has made almost a signature. But the more you watch with attention to the music, the more you realize that every choice is intentional. The showrunners have talked about spending significant time in the writer's room discussing what a particular scene's music should achieve thematically, not just emotionally. That level of deliberateness in music supervision is rare in television, and it contributes enormously to the show's distinctive feel. Now, I want to talk about something that I think represents the deepest layer of what The Boys is actually doing. And this is the part where I want you to really pay attention. The show is, at its core, about power. Specifically about what happens to people and institutions when accountability disappears. The superheroes in the world of The Boys operate with impunity not because they're evil by nature, but because the system that surrounds them has been designed to protect them from consequences. Vought doesn't just sell heroes. Vought manufactures the conditions under which heroes can do whatever they want and never face a reckoning. Sound familiar? What Kripke and his writers' room have consistently done across the show's run is update their satirical targets to reflect the specific moment in which each season was being produced and released. The show has addressed media manipulation, social media culture, the celebrity industrial complex, political extremism, corporate immunity, and the way that charisma can be weaponized against populations who are desperate for someone to believe in. These aren't background elements. They're the actual subject matter that the superhero aesthetic is being used to examine. In interviews, Kripke has been remarkably transparent about the fact that the show is political by design, not by accident. He has specifically discussed wanting to create content that could cut through the noise of an extremely saturated media environment by being so viscerally entertaining that viewers would engage with ideas they might otherwise avoid. The superheroes are the delivery mechanism. The ideas are the payload. Here's something about the casting process that I find endlessly fascinating. Jack Quaid, who plays Huey Campbell, the closest thing the show has to a traditional audience surrogate and everyman protagonist, was cast in part because of a quality the producers identified as essential and genuinely rare. He reads as genuinely decent. In a show populated by characters who are compromised, damaged, corrupted, or operating in moral grey zones of varying density, Huey needs to function as the viewer's point of entry. He can't be too naive or he's annoying. He can't be too savvy or he loses the quality that makes him sympathetic. Quaid threads this needle in a way that even the writers have described as unexpectedly precise. What's interesting is that Quaid comes from significant entertainment industry family background, being the son of two well-known actors, and yet his interpretation of Huey is so grounded and specific that it never feels like a legacy casting choice. He did something distinct with the character. There's a quality of performance in Quaid's work that suggests genuine investment in who Huey is as a person, and that investment pays off across the arc of the series in ways that become increasingly clear as Huey is put through more and more pressure. Let me tell you about a behind-the-scenes element that surprised me when I first learned about it. The writer's room for The Boys is unusually large and unusually diverse in its composition compared to typical cable or streaming dramas. Kripke has made specific choices about who is in that room and what range of perspectives and experiences those writers bring. This has a direct impact on the show's content in ways you might not expect. The storylines that deal with race, with gender, with sexuality, with class, are not being written from a single homogeneous perspective and then polished. They're being generated and challenged by a room full of people who have different stakes in those conversations. The result is that the show's political commentary, even when it's provocative or uncomfortable, tends to have a specificity and an accountability to it that pure satire sometimes lacks. Now let's go somewhere that I think is genuinely surprising for most viewers. The relationship between The Boys and professional wrestling is something that the creative team has acknowledged, and that is built into the show's DNA in ways that aren't immediately obvious. Professional wrestling, at its core, is about characters who are presented as real performing narratives that everyone knows are constructed, while both the performers and the audience participate in a collective agreement to engage with those narratives as if they're genuine. This is called kayfabe, and it is exactly what Vought does with superheroes. The superheroes are performing characters. The public knows on some level that they're being sold something. And yet the emotional investment is real because the need that the performance fulfills is real. Homelandish rallies have the energy of wrestling heels working a crowd. The crowd knows they're being played, but the feeling they get from the playing is genuine, and that genuine feeling is the actual product being sold. This parallel between superhero culture and professional wrestling is something the show has leaned into increasingly, and it explains a lot about why Homelander's relationship with his fan base feels so eerily familiar. Here's another production detail that's worth knowing about. Filming the Homelander laser eye sequences requires an extraordinary amount of practical on-set work that then gets enhanced in post-production. Anthony Starr has to perform in very specific physical ways with specific eye directions and facial tensions to create the base footage that the effects team can then work with. In interviews, Starr has described the experience of performing a laser sequence as requiring a kind of physical concentration that is different from regular acting work because you're committing to a physical action while knowing that the actual visible result of that action will only exist in post-production. You have to be fully present in something you can't actually see. Let's talk about Soldier Boy for a moment, because the addition of Jensen Ackles to the cast in the third season is one of the more interesting casting decisions in the show's run. Ackles came into The Boys with an enormous existing fan base from his years as Dean Winchester on Supernatural, a show Eric Kripke actually created. That relationship between Kripke and Ackles spans more than a decade of creative collaboration, and the decision to bring Ackles into The Boys universe is loaded with that history. Kripke has been clear in interviews that he wanted Ackles specifically and wrote the role of Soldier Boy with that casting in mind. What's interesting about Soldier Boy as a character is that he functions as a deconstructed version of the classic American hero archetype, specifically the World War II era heroism mythology that American culture has used to construct a specific self-image. Soldier Boy is what happens when the mythology of American greatness is stripped down to its actual human components, and you have to reckon with what's actually there. Ackles' performance brings a quality that's essential to making this work. There's a genuine star presence to him, a physical confidence and charisma that makes it credible that this person could have been a symbol. And then the show systematically reveals the gap between the symbol and the reality. It's classic Boys territory, but executed with particular effectiveness because the casting itself does part of the thematic work. I want to circle back to something about Homelander that I think is the most psychologically interesting aspect of the entire show. The character's core wound is not about power. It's about love. Specifically, the absence of it during the developmental period when human beings are most vulnerable to its absence. Homelander was raised in a laboratory. The people who had authority over him treated him as an asset rather than a child. He was never taught to attach to other people in a healthy way because the environment he was raised in did not permit healthy attachment. The result is a being with the power of a god and the emotional architecture of someone who never learned how to be safe. This is why Homelander's rages look the way they do. They don't look like the calculated evil of a villain who has chosen a path. They look like the eruptions of someone who has never had the internal resources to regulate the size of what they feel. When Homelander destroys something, there's a quality to it that reads as terrifyingly childlike. Not innocent. The opposite of innocent. But childlike in the sense that the proportion between the stimulus and the response belongs to someone who was never given the tools to close that gap. Anthony Starr and the writers have described working through this psychology in granular detail, specifically because they wanted Homelander to be frightening in a way that was also comprehensible. Not sympathetic necessarily, but comprehensible. Because a villain who is purely and simply evil is not as frightening as a villain whose damage you can trace back to a source. One more production element that I think is really worth highlighting. The show's costume design is doing constant visual storytelling that functions completely independently of the dialogue and the action. Every superhero costume is designed as a statement about who that character is presenting themselves to be and what that presentation is concealing. Homelander's suit is the most obvious example. Its American flags and primary colors and the visual language of classical superhero design, and it sits on a man whose interior reality is the opposite of everything those design choices are supposed to represent. The costume is a lie, and it's designed to read as one once you know the character, while still being designed to read as the real thing to the crowd. The boys' look, the working class, lived-in, practical aesthetic of their clothing and their environment, is equally deliberate. They wear what people wear when they're not performing anything, when they're just surviving. The contrast between the visual register of the superheroes and the visual register of the boys themselves is a constant silent argument the show is making about authenticity and performance. Let me give you something you can take away from this video and use the next time you're watching the show. When you watch a scene involving Homelander and a crowd of supporters, pay attention to where his eyes go when the crowd responds to something he's said. There's specific performance work in those moments. Starr has talked about playing Homelander's reaction to crowd approval as the closest thing the character ever gets to feeling genuinely fed. Not happy. Federation. Like the love of the crowd is a substance that fills something in him temporarily without ever actually nourishing him. And if you watch for that specific quality in those moments, you'll see it. It changes how the rallies feel. They stop being scenes of power and become scenes of hunger. That recontextualization is available throughout the show once you know where to look. The Boys rewards close attention in a way that a lot of action-oriented content doesn't bother to earn. The surface level is extremely entertaining on its own terms. But underneath that surface is a show that has done the work of a genuinely serious piece of culture, one that has something real and uncomfortable to say about the world that made it. Now here's something that I think is genuinely underappreciated when people talk about the show's legacy. The Boys arrived at a specific cultural moment. Superhero content had reached a kind of total market saturation. Every major studio had a shared universe. Every streaming service was developing cape content. The genre had become so dominant that it was starting to collapse under its own weight, with audiences showing early signs of fatigue in a way that the studios were struggling to acknowledge. Into that moment came a show that was not anti-superhero in the simple sense of just replacing good guys with bad guys. It was something more surgically precise than that. It was a show that identified the specific psychological needs that superhero stories fulfill in their audience, and then asked what happens when those needs are exploited rather than genuinely met. That question landed because it was the right question at the right time. And it landed in a way that didn't alienate the audience who loved superheroes. It landed in a way that made that audience think more clearly about what they were loving and why. That's a difficult creative trick to pull off, and the show pulls it off consistently across its run. The show's commercial success, which has been significant, is itself a kind of argument the show is making. It became one of the most watched properties on its platform. It generated enormous cultural conversation. It spawned spin-off content. All of this happened because it was doing something that the content it was criticizing had stopped doing, which was treating its audience as intelligent adults who deserved to have genuinely challenging ideas delivered to them inside genuinely entertaining packaging. And that, ultimately, might be the most interesting fact about The Boys. Not any specific behind-the-scenes detail, not any specific performance choice, not any specific production decision, though all of those are fascinating and worth knowing. The most interesting fact is that it exists at all. That a show this angry, this political, this willing to be genuinely offensive in service of genuine ideas, found an audience of millions. That it became mainstream without becoming safe. That it influenced how the industry thinks about superhero content at exactly the moment when that influence was needed. If you've been watching this show and you've enjoyed it without fully understanding why it hits differently than everything else in the genre, I hope this video gave you some of what you were looking for. The craft is visible once you know where to look. The intentions are accessible once someone points you toward them. And the experience of going back and watching with all of this in your head is something I genuinely recommend. Because there's a version of watching The Boys where you're just along for the ride, and the ride is genuinely excellent. But there's another version where you're watching a group of extraordinarily talented people who are angry about real things using the most entertaining possible vehicle to say those things as loudly as they can. That version is better. Drop in the comments which facts surprised you the most. And if you want more deep dives into the shows and films that are doing things that deserve more attention and more analysis, hit that subscribe button because this channel is exactly that. See you in the next one. The most chaotic, violent show on television was specifically designed to put you to sleep, and somehow, that's exactly what's going to happen tonight. The Boys is one of those rare shows that operates on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, it looks like a superhero story, but underneath it's a sharp, biting piece of social commentary wrapped in some of the most outrageous television ever produced. And the more you dig into the details, the more fascinating it becomes. So let's start at the very beginning, with the origins of the whole thing. The show is based on a comic book series written by Garth Ennis and illustrated by Derek Robertson. The comics were actually so controversial and so dark that DC Comics originally dropped the series before it even really got going. They decided the content was just too extreme for their imprint. The series eventually found a home with Dynamite Entertainment and ran for 72 issues. Now here's what's interesting about that. When the show was eventually developed for Amazon Prime Video, the showrunner Eric Kripke, who you might know from creating Supernatural, made it very clear early on that the show would not be a direct copy of the comics. They would take the spirit, the themes, the characters, and the general shape of the story, but they would tell it in their own way. And that approach turned out to be one of the smartest decisions anyone made in the entire production. Now, as you're lying there starting to relax, let's talk about the names in this show, because the naming conventions are actually really clever and worth thinking about as you drift. Vought International, the corporation at the center of everything, is named after Friedrich Vought, a fictional Nazi scientist who supposedly created the original compound that gives soups their powers during World War II. That backstory gets explored more and more as the seasons progress, and it adds this genuinely unsettling historical weight to what could have just been a fun fictional evil corporation. Instead, it becomes something with actual roots, a lineage of awfulness that stretches back decades. There's real craft in that kind of world building, and it rewards viewers who pay attention. Speaking of world building, the show creates an entire fictional media landscape around Vought. There are fake movie trailers, fake news networks, fake merchandise, fake social media personalities for the superheroes. The level of detail that the production team puts into this parallel world is genuinely remarkable. There are actual functioning websites for Vought International, fake social media accounts for characters like Homelander and Starlight, and promotional materials that get released online to build hype before new seasons. It's one of the most immersive transmedia experiences any streaming show has ever created. And it works because it mirrors our actual world just closely enough to feel a little too real. Let's take a quiet moment and think about Homelander, because he is one of the most carefully constructed villains in recent television history. Anthony Starr, the actor who plays him, is actually from New Zealand. And he has spoken in various interviews about the psychological research he did to prepare for the role. Homelander is not just a powerful bad guy. He's a deeply traumatized individual who was essentially raised in a lab, denied genuine human connection, and turned into both a weapon and a product simultaneously. The team at the show worked to create a character who is terrifying but also, in very specific moments, genuinely pitiable. Not sympathetic in a way that excuses his actions, but pitiable in a way that makes you understand how someone becomes a monster. And here is something that's really interesting to hold on to as you relax. The show consistently explores this idea that fear and power interact in very specific ways. Characters who are visibly afraid of Homelander often end up in worse situations than characters who manage to hold their ground or show him genuine humanity. That's not just a plot mechanic. It's actually rooted in real psychology around dominance and submission dynamics. The writers clearly thought carefully about how power operates, not just in superhero stories, but in corporations, governments, and interpersonal relationships. That's the kind of intellectual depth that makes The Boys worth thinking about even when you're winding down. Now let's float over to talking about the cast, because there are some wonderful little facts here that you might find soothing to drift through. Carl Urban, who plays Billy Butcher, kept his American accent throughout filming for the first several seasons, which is especially impressive given that Urban is a New Zealander. His natural accent is actually quite different from Butcher's specific British working-class voice, which itself required significant dialect work. So Urban was doing a British working-class accent while being a New Zealander working primarily in North America. That's 3 layers of performance just in the voice. Jack Quaid, who plays Huey Campbell, is the son of actors Dennis Quaid and Meg Ryan. He actually modeled some of Huey's nervous energy and emotional accessibility on his own natural personality, describing himself as someone who genuinely feels things deeply and tends to show it. And it shows on screen, because Huey is one of the few characters in the entire show who consistently operates from a place of genuine moral feeling rather than pragmatism or self-interest. He's often wrong about how to act on that moral feeling, but the feeling itself is always real. That's what makes him such an effective anchor for the audience. As you settle deeper into comfort, let's talk about the title cards and episode naming conventions, because there's real thought here too. Episodes of The Boys are often titled after songs, album names, or cultural references that thematically connect to what happens in the story. The show uses these titles as a kind of secondary layer of meaning, a hint at the emotional register of what you're about to watch. For people who catch the references, there's an extra layer of satisfaction. For people who don't, the episodes still work perfectly on their own terms. That's good design. It works on multiple levels without requiring any particular prior knowledge. The production design of The Boys is something that deserves its own appreciation. The Seven's headquarters, the tower, the corporate spaces, all of that was designed to feel like the nightmare version of what you might imagine a superhero-themed corporation actually looking like. Sleek, expensive, deliberately intimidating. The production team drew on references from real corporate architecture, the kind of glass and steel aesthetic that major tech companies and financial firms use to project power and permanence. By putting superheroes in that specific visual context, the show immediately signals that this is not your typical superhero story. This is a story about what happens when power goes entirely unchecked. Let me drift us towards something a little more specific and fun. The Legend of the Legend character, played by Paul Racer, is designed as a nod to real figures from comic book history. In the comics, the character was conceived as a reference to legendary creators who built entire fictional universes and whose legacy became complicated over time. The show uses the character somewhat differently, as a kind of institutional memory for the world of Vought, someone who was there at the beginning and carries all that complicated history. Paul Racer brings a genuine warmth and world weariness to the role that makes the character immediately compelling even without all the context. Something that's easy to miss but worth appreciating as you drift is how the show handles its supporting characters. Even minor characters who only appear in a handful of scenes tend to have coherent internal logic. They have things they want, things they're afraid of, reasons for their behavior that make sense within the world. That kind of consistency is extremely hard to maintain across a large ensemble cast over multiple seasons, and it speaks to a writer's room that takes its work seriously even when the content on screen is absolutely ridiculous. Now let's think about the physical production of the show for a moment, because it was filmed primarily in Toronto, Canada, with occasional location shoots elsewhere. Toronto is one of the great filming cities in the world precisely because it can convincingly double for so many different American environments depending on how you shoot it. The production team was skilled at using the city's varied architecture to create different feels for different parts of the fictional world. The corporate Vought spaces feel different from the street-level neighborhoods where Butcher and his crew operate, and that visual distinction is part of how the show maintains its thematic contrasts. Take a slow breath in and out. Let's talk about the soundtrack choices on the show, because they're frequently surprising and always intentional. The music supervisors have a talent for selecting songs that create ironic contrast with what's happening on screen. Extremely violent or disturbing sequences are sometimes scored with cheerful or nostalgic music, and that juxtaposition does something interesting to your experience as a viewer. It creates a kind of cognitive dissonance that reflects the show's central theme, that the most dangerous things often come packaged in the most appealing containers. Superheroes look like heroes. They're branded, marketed, beloved. And yet, the show's writing team has talked about how they approach each season by first identifying what real-world dynamics they want to explore and then building the story around those dynamics. Rather than starting with plot mechanics and then imposing themes afterward, they start with the question of what they actually want to say. What aspect of power, media, celebrity, corporate behavior, or political manipulation do they want to examine this season? And then they build everything else around that core inquiry. That's a fundamentally different approach from how many television shows are written, and it helps explain why The Boys feels so coherent even when the individual episodes are wildly chaotic. As you sink a little deeper into relaxation, let's appreciate the show's approach to female characters, because it's worth noting. The show has consistently worked to give its female characters agency, complexity, and storylines that aren't just in service of the male characters' arcs. Characters like Starlight, Queen Maeve, Sage, and others are all fully realized people with their own motivations, their own histories, and their own relationships to power. Some of them make choices that are questionable or even terrible. But they're making those choices for their own reasons, not just to serve as props in someone else's story. That's harder to accomplish than it sounds, and the show does it consistently. The relationship between the show and its source material is genuinely interesting from a craft perspective. Kripke and his team knew that a straight adaptation of the comics would not work for mainstream television, both because of content limitations and because the comic-specific satirical targets were rooted in a particular cultural moment that had already passed. So they kept the architecture of the original but renovated everything inside, updating the targets, deepening the character work, and finding new ways to make the core satirical points land for a contemporary audience. It's a masterclass in adaptation as creative interpretation rather than literal translation. Let your shoulders drop a little. Let your jaw unclench. We are going to keep drifting through some of the quieter corners of this fascinating world. The decision to make Homelander an explicit parallel to certain real-world figures was a deliberate choice that the show has leaned into more heavily as the seasons have progressed. The writers have talked about how they're interested in the psychology of charisma, specifically how someone with genuine charisma can use it to get away with increasingly terrible behavior while maintaining a loyal following. Homelander's trajectory across the seasons is essentially a study in how that escalation works. Each season he goes a little further. Each season his followers rationalize a little harder. And the show asks you to sit with the discomfort of recognizing those patterns from the real world. The Compound V mythology in the show is another area where the writers did careful, detailed thinking. The idea that superhero powers come from a pharmaceutical product developed by a corporation means that powers are not inherently heroic. They are manufactured. They are commodified. They are controlled. The corporation decides who gets them, under what conditions, with what restrictions. And that shifts the entire moral landscape of the story in ways that the show keeps exploring from new angles. What does it mean to have power that belongs to someone else? What do you owe them in return? And what happens when you decide you owe them nothing? We are somewhere past the midpoint of our journey now, and you might be feeling that lovely heavy relaxed sensation starting to settle in. Let's keep the thoughts soft and interesting. The character of Mother's Milk, played by Laz Alonso, is one of the show's most thoughtful additions to the story from the original comics. The television version of the character has a much more developed personal life, with family relationships and a specific history with Vought that gives his involvement in the boys' mission a personal dimension beyond just general opposition to corporate superheroism. That kind of specificity is what turns a functional plot character into someone you actually care about. And caring about the characters is what makes the show's darker moments hit as hard as they do. The costume design across the show also reflects the satirical intelligence at work throughout. The Seven's costumes are designed to look like premium branded merchandise, which is exactly what they are in the world of the show. They're commercially designed, focus grouped, optimized for merchandising and media presence. There's nothing organic or personal about them. Contrast that with the more worn, practical aesthetic of Butcher and the boys, and the visual language immediately tells you something true about where both groups are coming from. One side is performing. The other side, whatever their flaws, is at least being real about what they're doing. Frenchie's character, played by Tomer Capone, has one of the more interesting emotional arcs across the seasons. He carries a significant amount of guilt from his past, guilt that the show slowly unpacks over time, and his relationships with other team members are colored by that guilt in ways that aren't always immediately obvious. Capone has talked about how he approached the character as someone who uses humor and performance as a defense mechanism, keeping people at a specific distance while simultaneously craving genuine connection. That's a very specific and very human psychological profile, and the show gives him enough space to actually explore it. The show's approach to humor is worth appreciating as you let your thoughts drift and slow. The comedy in The Boys is often extremely dark, but it's not mean-spirited in a simple way. The show tends to aim its harshest satirical energy upward, at the powerful and the corrupt and the hypocritical, rather than downward at the vulnerable. The people who get the sharpest treatment are almost always people who deserve it. And within the chaos and darkness, the show also finds moments of genuine warmth and even tenderness between characters who care about each other. Those moments of genuine human connection are what give the darker stuff its weight. Kimiko's character, played by Karen Fukuhara, operates largely without dialogue for significant portions of the earlier seasons, communicating primarily through physicality and expression. Fukuhara has spoken about how she worked with the production team to develop a full internal emotional life for Kimiko even in scenes where she has nothing to say. The result is a character who communicates volumes without words, which is actually a very difficult performance skill. Every fight sequence Kimiko is in is also choreographed to reflect her specific character rather than just generic action choreography. The way she moves tells you who she is. Let the thoughts come slower now. Let them float rather than race. One of the things that makes The Boys genuinely distinctive in the landscape of prestige television is its willingness to be genuinely uncomfortable. Not just edgy or provocative for attention, but actually uncomfortable in ways that make you think about your own relationship with the things being satirized. How much of your media consumption is driven by parasocial attachment to celebrity rather than actual values alignment? How often do you accept the branding of something rather than looking at what's underneath it? The show keeps asking those questions, not by putting them into dialogue, but by making you feel the discomfort of the answer. The visual effects work on the show has consistently punched above what you might expect for a television production. The team uses a combination of practical effects, stunt work, and digital effects, and they blend them in ways that keep the action feeling grounded even when the things happening are completely impossible. That groundedness is important because it keeps the characters feeling like people rather than cartoon figures. And when the characters feel like people, the story can actually mean something. Ashley's character arc across the seasons is one of the more quietly interesting threads in the whole show. She starts as a corporate functionary, someone who has genuinely sacrificed her better instincts in service of institutional advancement. And she stays in that compromised position through sheer determined avoidance of anything that might get her noticed or eliminated. There's something both comic and genuinely sad about a character whose primary survival strategy is to become as invisible and inoffensive as possible while surrounded by chaos. And the show is smart enough to acknowledge both dimensions without letting either overwhelm the other. Your breathing is probably slower now. Your body heavier. This is a good place to be. The show's satirical targets have shifted slightly from season to season as the real-world context has evolved. What started primarily as a satire of superhero media and corporate power has expanded to include social media dynamics, political demagoguery, religious institutions, and the psychology of movements built around charismatic but deeply flawed leaders. The writers have proven consistently willing to follow the thematic logic wherever it leads rather than staying in a comfortable lane. That's riskier, and it occasionally means the show overreaches, but it also means it stays genuinely engaged with the world rather than just recycling the same observations. Soulja Boy's character, played by Jensen Ackles, was a significant addition to the later seasons. Ackles, who had worked with Kripke on Supernatural, brought a specific kind of effortless charisma to the role that serves the character perfectly. Soulja Boy is supposed to feel like a certain era's idea of heroism, confident, physical, unreflective, deeply rooted in a set of values that look romantic from a distance and deeply problematic up close. Ackles plays all of that in a performance that's funny and disturbing in roughly equal measure, which is exactly the balance the show was going for. The show's depiction of media dynamics is one of its most consistently sharp satirical elements. Vought functions like a media company as much as anything else, because its superheroes are intellectual properties as much as they are people. They are brands. Their public images are managed with the same ruthless professionalism that any corporation would apply to its most valuable assets. And the show keeps returning to the gap between that carefully managed image and the reality underneath. That gap is where the horror lives. And also, frequently, where the comedy lives. As you settle towards sleep, hold on to this last thought. The Boys is ultimately a show about accountability, specifically what happens when accountability fails, when power goes unchecked, when the systems designed to keep the powerful honest are captured by the powerful themselves. And what it asks is whether ordinary people with ordinary resources and deeply imperfect characters can find ways to hold on to something true in that environment. It doesn't always give optimistic answers, but it takes the question seriously. And that seriousness, underneath all the chaos and the outrageous spectacle, is what makes it matter. Let your thoughts drift now like the quietest possible version of this enormous chaotic world, just the interesting ideas floating by without weight or urgency, the craft that went into building it, the care that went into the characters, the intelligence underneath the madness. Let all of it carry you gently down into a deep and restful sleep. You've earned it. Good night. Before Carl Urban ever said a single word as Billy Butcher, the showrunner behind Supernatural sat down and made a quiet decision that would change how millions of people think about superheroes forever. The Boys premiered on Amazon Prime Video on July 26, 2019. The first season dropped all 8 episodes at once, which was a deliberate choice. The creators wanted viewers to experience the story as one continuous journey rather than waiting week to week. It was a binge-first design, and it worked. The show immediately captured millions of viewers and sparked conversations that spread across every corner of the internet. But long before anyone watched a single frame of that show, it existed as a comic book. Garth Ennis and Derek Robertson created The Boys as a comic series that ran from 2006 to 2012. The source material was even more extreme than what made it to television. Showrunner Eric Kripke, who you might know from creating Supernatural, took the comic and carefully shaped it into something that could work as a prestige streaming drama without losing its sharp satirical edge. That balancing act was one of the most interesting creative challenges the production team faced. Eric Kripke has spoken openly about how the show functions primarily as political and social satire. The superheroes in the world of The Boys are not noble protectors. They are corporate products managed by a company called Vought International. Everything about them, their image, their merchandise, their public appearances, is manufactured and controlled. Kripke wanted to use that fictional world as a mirror held up to real celebrity culture, corporate power, and media manipulation. The result was something that felt uncomfortably familiar. Let's talk about the casting process because it was genuinely fascinating. Carl Urban, the actor who plays Billy Butcher, the fierce and relentless leader of The Boys, was not the first person considered for the role. The character is described as having a very specific energy, a coiled tension beneath every word, a volcanic anger always threatening to erupt. Urban brought something irreplaceable to that character. His performance is layered with pain and conviction in a way that made audiences deeply invested in a person who is objectively doing morally questionable things. Urban himself prepared for the role by leaning into the character's backstory, particularly the traumatic loss that drives Butcher's obsession with superheroes. That grief is what makes Butcher understandable even when he's not sympathetic. It's one of the more sophisticated character constructions in the first season. Now here's something that might surprise you. Anthony Starr, who plays Homelander, the show's primary antagonist, is actually from New Zealand. His natural accent is nothing like the polished, all-American voice he uses as Homelander. Starr worked extensively with a dialect coach to perfect that voice, because Homelander needed to sound like the idealized version of American heroism, the kind of voice that reads as trustworthy and wholesome even when everything else about the character is deeply wrong. Anthony Starr has described Homelander as one of the most challenging roles he has ever taken on. Not physically, but psychologically. Playing a character who is simultaneously terrifying and deeply pathetic, who craves approval while also being capable of casual cruelty, required a very specific kind of internal work. Starr has mentioned in interviews that he had to find genuine sympathy for Homelander in order to play him truthfully. He had to understand the character's emotional deprivation and loneliness without excusing any of the monstrous behavior. The writing team spent considerable time developing Homelander's psychological profile. They drew on concepts related to narcissistic personality disorder and what happens when a person grows up completely isolated from genuine human connection. Homelander was raised in a laboratory environment. He never experienced normal childhood bonds. That backstory, revealed gradually through the first season, reframes him from a simple villain into something more tragic and disturbing. Jack Quaid, who plays Huey Campbell, the emotional center of the show, is the son of actor Dennis Quaid and singer Meg Ryan. He grew up in a household with significant Hollywood experience around him, but he pursued his own path methodically. The Huey character is the audience's entry point into this world. When the series begins, Huey is an ordinary young man working a simple job and navigating a comfortable, if somewhat stagnant, relationship. His world gets destroyed in the very first episode in an incident involving a superhero that is simultaneously shocking and darkly comedic. The creators made a deliberate choice to anchor the show through Huey's perspective precisely because he starts from a place of genuine innocence. He has no agenda. He has no mission. He is simply someone who has been catastrophically wronged by a system that protects the powerful and discards ordinary people. Watching him evolve across the first season from heartbroken bystander to active participant in something morally complicated is one of the most satisfying character arcs in the entire run. Erin Moriarty plays Annie January, also known as Starlight, and her storyline in Season 1 is perhaps the most emotionally resonant of all the characters on the superhero side of the story. Annie begins the season achieving her lifelong dream of joining the Seven, the show's version of a premier superhero team. Within her first hours as a member, that dream begins to crumble as she discovers the reality behind the institution she idolized. The show uses Annie's story to explore themes around exploitation, the corruption of idealism, and the experience of speaking up about wrongdoing in environments that punish honesty. Moriarty has spoken about how meaningful those themes were to her personally, and how she wanted to honor the authenticity of what the character was experiencing. Her performance throughout Season 1 walks a careful line between vulnerability and strength that accumulates real emotional power by the finale. Let's slow down for a moment. If you're drifting, that's perfectly fine. Let these facts just float through your mind gently. There's no urgency here. Just interesting details about a fascinating show, delivered at a comfortable pace. Take another slow breath. Let your muscles relax a little more. The production design of The Boys is worth discussing because it's a significant part of what makes the show feel grounded and real despite its fantastical premise. The design team made very deliberate choices about how superheroes would dress, move through public spaces, and interact with corporate environments. The Seven's headquarters was designed to feel like a combination of a tech company campus and a luxury hotel. Everything is sleek and impressive on the surface, with an underlying sterility that suggests something is very wrong beneath the polished exterior. The costumes for the Seven required months of development. Homelander's suit in particular was engineered to communicate specific things about the character. The American flag imagery is obvious, but the details of how the suit fits, how it moves, and how it photographs under different lighting conditions were all carefully calibrated. The costume designers wanted it to look genuinely impressive at a distance while also feeling slightly wrong up close, almost too perfect, like a mannequin come to life. The show filmed primarily in Toronto, Canada, which might be surprising given how thoroughly American the setting feels. Toronto has become a major production hub for American film and television, and the city has many locations that can convincingly stand in for various American urban environments. The production team worked hard to ensure that nothing felt obviously Canadian, carefully controlling background details, signage, and architectural elements that might break the illusion. One of the more technically impressive sequences in the first season involves a speedboat on the Hudson River that intersects with a whale. This scene required an enormous amount of coordination between practical effects and digital effects teams. The sequence is one of the show's most memorably absurd and shocking moments, and creating it involved challenges around how to make the digital elements feel physically real and weighty rather than obviously computer-generated. The effects team has spoken about the complexity of that particular sequence and how proud they were of the final result. The show's approach to violence was a conscious artistic and thematic choice. The violence in The Boys is not stylized or made to look cool. It is almost always visceral, consequential, and uncomfortable to watch. This was deliberate. The creators wanted to reject the tradition of superhero films and television shows where violence happens without lasting physical or emotional consequences. In The Boys, things break and people do not simply recover. That approach reinforces the show's central argument about how we glamorize power and ignore its costs. The music choices throughout Season 1 are also worth appreciating. The show uses familiar popular songs in moments where the contrast between the cheerful music and the disturbing events on screen creates an unsettling effect. This technique has roots in the tradition of films like A Clockwork Orange and Reservoir Dogs, where the juxtaposition of upbeat music with dark content forces the audience to examine their own emotional responses. The Boys uses this tool with precision. Now let's talk about some of the smaller details that dedicated viewers discovered. The fictional brand of Vought International is embedded throughout the world of the show in ways that casual viewers might miss. There are Vought advertisements in the background of scenes. Vought products appear on shelves. The company's influence is visible in every corner of the world these characters inhabit, which reinforces the idea that Vought is not just a powerful company but a totalizing presence in the culture of this fictional America. The show also includes many satirical references to real-world corporate and political behavior. When Vought executives discuss strategy, their conversations echo actual discussions that happen in boardrooms around marketing, crisis management, and the protection of brand value. When politicians in the show debate whether superheroes should be incorporated into the military, the arguments mirror actual debates about corporate power and the relationship between private entities and government functions. These parallels are entirely intentional. Elizabeth Shue plays Madeline Stillwell, a senior Vought executive who manages Homelander among other heroes. Her performance is fascinating because she plays a character who is completely comfortable with moral corruption while maintaining a surface warmth and professionalism. Stillwell is one of the more chilling figures in the first season because she never seems frightened by what she knows about the people she manages. The dynamic between Stillwell and Homelander is one of the first season's most psychologically interesting relationships. Chase Crawford plays the Deep, a member of the Seven whose storyline in Season 1 functions as both satire and a surprisingly earnest exploration of accountability. The Deep believes himself to be a significant and respected figure. The reality is more complicated. Crawford has spoken about how he appreciated the writers giving the character genuine consequences for his actions, while also allowing space for the audience to understand how someone could be simultaneously culpable and limited in their self-awareness. Laz Alonso plays Mother's Milk, a member of the Boys whose grounded pragmatism makes him one of the most watchable characters in the ensemble. The character has a family, a wife and daughter, which immediately raises the emotional stakes around his involvement in the dangerous work the Boys are doing. Alonso has discussed how important it was to him that Mother's Milk not be reduced to a one-dimensional tough guy, that the family element be taken seriously and used to illuminate the real costs of the life he is leading. Karen Fukuhara plays Kimiko, a character who is introduced under circumstances that make her appear dangerous and unpredictable. Her arc across the first season is one of quiet revelation. As audiences learn more about where she came from and what was done to her, the character shifts from a threat to someone who is herself a victim of the same system the Boys are fighting against. Fukuhara has spoken about how she worked to communicate Kimiko's inner life entirely through physical performance, since the character does not speak, and how liberating and challenging that constraint was. Toma Capone plays Frenchie, a member of the Boys whose backstory involves a complicated personal history with crime and moral failure. Frenchie's relationship with Kimiko becomes one of the emotional cores of the show, and the development of that connection across the first season is handled with more delicacy and care than you might expect from a show with this reputation for intensity. Let the details settle around you like something soft and warm. You don't need to hold onto every word. Just let them drift by. The facts are interesting. The stories are real. And there's nothing you need to do right now except breathe slowly and let yourself be still. The showrunners have discussed how the first season was deliberately structured to escalate in a specific way. The opening episodes establish the world and introduce the central characters. The middle episodes deepen the stakes and complicate the moral landscape. The final episodes push every character to a point where they cannot return to where they started. This three-act structure is applied both to the season as a whole and to individual episodes. One of the creative decisions that had the biggest impact on how audiences received the show was the choice to make the Boys themselves morally compromised. These are not simply heroic rebels fighting an evil system. They use deception, manipulation, and violence. Billy Butcher makes choices throughout the first season that are difficult to defend. The audience is asked to root for people who are themselves capable of serious wrongdoing, which creates a more honest and uncomfortable viewing experience than most superhero narratives offer. The relationship between Butcher and Huey is one of the most carefully developed dynamics in Season 1. Butcher sees Huey as useful and recruits him for that reason. But as the season progresses, something more complex develops between them. There is a paternalistic affection that Butcher has difficulty acknowledging, and a hero worship in Huey that gradually gives way to a more clear-eyed and troubled understanding of who Butcher actually is. By the end of the season, the relationship has been tested in ways that neither character could have anticipated. The finale of Season 1, the 8th episode, delivers several significant revelations and shifts the emotional landscape of nearly every major storyline. Without dwelling on specific plot details in a way that might feel too stimulating for sleep, it's worth noting that the writers made sure every character ends the season in a fundamentally different place than where they began. This is good storytelling discipline. Every journey should cost something and change the traveler. Let's take a slower moment. Think about how warm and comfortable you are right now. The details of the show can just wash over you gently. There's no test, no reason to stay sharp. Just interesting things to think about as your mind gets quieter and quieter. The ratings and reception that The Boys received after its premiere were exceptional for an original streaming series. Critics praised its willingness to be genuinely provocative rather than provocative in a safe and calculated way. Audiences responded to the feeling that the show trusted them to handle complicated ideas and morally ambiguous characters without being given easy answers. The show earned multiple award nominations from various industry bodies following its first season. Anthony Starr received particular attention for his work as Homelander, with many critics noting that the character could easily have become cartoonish but instead became genuinely unsettling because of the specificity and humanity Starr brought to the performance. There was a significant amount of thought put into how Vaught's superheroes would be presented as celebrities. The creative team studied real celebrity media coverage extensively to understand how publicity machines work, how carefully constructed images are built and maintained, and how scandals are managed or suppressed. The result is a fictional celebrity culture that feels immediately recognizable because it is based so closely on real patterns of behavior. The show's satirical targets in Season 1 include media consolidation, pharmaceutical companies, the military-industrial complex, organized religion, and the entertainment industry. Each of these targets is embedded in the world of the show not through monologues or editorial moments but through the texture of how the world operates. Characters live inside these systems. The critique emerges from the story itself rather than being stated explicitly. One detail that many viewers found interesting is the way the show portrays the relationship between superheroes and religion. Annie comes from a religious background and has connected her faith to her identity as a hero. The show treats this with more nuance than you might expect, exploring how institutions can co-opt genuine belief for purposes that have nothing to do with the spiritual values at the heart of that belief. The production budget for the first season of The Boys was substantial, reflecting Amazon's commitment to competing with other premium streaming services by investing in genuinely cinematic productions. The money is visible on screen in the quality of the effects work, the production design, and the ability to shoot in multiple locations with large casts and complex sequences. The sound design of the show deserves recognition as well. The way certain scenes are constructed orally, with precise control of ambient sound and music, creates an atmosphere that reinforces the emotional content of what is happening visually. The sound team worked to ensure that the show's quieter moments felt as carefully crafted as its most explosive sequences. Let the quiet of right now be something pleasant. Your breathing is probably slower than it was when we started. Your thoughts are probably less sharp. This is exactly where you want to be. There's still a little more to hear, so let it come gently. The Boys developed a passionate fan community very quickly after its premiere. Viewers created detailed analyses of the show's political subtext, character psychology, and narrative structure. Fan communities across multiple platforms generated discussion, fan art, theories, and creative work inspired by the show. This level of engagement is something the creators have spoken about with genuine appreciation, noting that the show sparked exactly the kind of conversation they hoped it would. Eric Kripke has been active in communicating with the audience about the show's intentions and themes. He has consistently framed the series as a work of satire that invites audiences to examine their own relationship with power, celebrity, and the stories we tell about what makes someone heroic. That clarity of artistic intention is part of what gives the show its coherence and impact. One of the more interesting technical aspects of the first season is how the directors handled the visual presentation of superpowers. The decision was made to ground the superhero action as much as possible in practical reality, rather than leaning into the spectacular visual glamour of big-budget superhero films. Powers are shown with a focus on physical cause and effect, on weight and mass and consequence, rather than as sources of cinematic wonder. This approach is another expression of the show's central thesis about demystifying power. The writing room for the first season was diverse in terms of perspective and background, which contributed to the range of angles from which the show examines its themes. Multiple writers brought different life experiences and areas of expertise to the development of storylines and characters, which is visible in the texture and specificity of the world the show creates. The show manages something genuinely difficult, which is being simultaneously funny and disturbing. Many scenes operate on both registers at once, which requires extraordinary precision in the writing, directing, and performance. The comedy never undermines the emotional reality of what is happening. The darkness never completely overwhelms the show's sense of absurdity. Maintaining that balance across 8 episodes of a first season is a real achievement. You might be feeling very comfortable right now. Maybe your eyes feel heavy, or your thoughts are starting to move more slowly. That's a perfectly natural place to be. There is no hurry. The show's details will still be here in the morning if you want to think about them again. For now, let them just be soft background texture as your mind moves toward rest. The boys of the title, the core group that Billy Butcher assembles, each brings something different to the team's dynamic. Butcher provides drive and ruthlessness. Huey provides moral perspective and emotional grounding. Mother's Milk provides discipline and structure. Frenchie provides expertise and an unexpected warmth. Kimiko provides capability and a kind of silent moral clarity. Together, they function as a counter-institution to Vought, fighting corporate power with improvisation and desperation. The Seven, Vaught's premier team, mirror and contrast the boys in interesting ways. Where the boys are held together by complicated personal loyalty, the Seven are held together by contract and performance. Where the boys are honest about what they are even when that honesty is uncomfortable, the Seven maintain a constant fiction about what they represent. This structural contrast is one of the show's most elegant organizational choices. The show ends its first season having established a world that is richly detailed, thematically coherent, and populated by characters whose futures remain genuinely uncertain. The choices made in those 8 episodes set up everything that would follow while also functioning as a complete story with its own beginning, middle, and resolution. For a show that arrived with the expectation of being provocative and extreme, The Boys Season 1 surprised many viewers with how emotionally engaged it made them. The satirical framework never prevented genuine feeling from emerging. The dark comedy never kept the dramatic stakes from feeling real. The political commentary never reduced the characters to mouthpieces. All of these elements coexisted because the creative team never lost sight of the human stories at the center of everything. Everything you've heard tonight is just a small selection from the full depth of interesting details available about this show. There are stories about specific production challenges, about lines that almost didn't make it into the final cut, about performances that surprised even the directors, about moments where the shoot went unexpectedly and something better emerged from the improvisation. Stories have layers, and this particular story has many. But that's all for now. Your breathing is slower. The words are coming more softly now. The day has been whatever it was, and now it's over, and you are warm and still in this moment, with nothing particular you need to do or think about. The interesting facts about the boys will keep. They'll be right there if you want to revisit them tomorrow. What matters right now is that you are comfortable, that your mind is gently occupied but not stimulated, that the world outside has gotten very quiet, and that the only thing you're asked to do in this moment is allow yourself to let go. The boys will be there. Season 1 will be exactly as it was. Butcher and Huey and Annie and all of the others will be right where you left them. None of it is going anywhere. And neither are you. You're right here, steady and still, and sleep is very close now, just at the edges of your awareness, warm and patient, waiting for you to stop holding on and simply fall into it. Drift down. Let go. Close whatever is left that's open. You've done well today. You've made it to this quiet place. And now there is nothing left to do except rest. Good night. Here's a gentle drift into something your brain can actually enjoy tonight. Jensen Ackles spent 15 years being one of TV's most beloved heroes. Then his old boss hired him to destroy that entire image, and the result broke the internet in 2022. The Boys first appeared on Amazon Prime Video back in 2019, and it immediately carved out its own unique space in the superhero genre. By the time Season 3 arrived in June of 2022, the show had become a full-blown cultural phenomenon. Season 3 pushed things even further than anyone expected, diving deeper into the politics, the satire, the violence, and the character development that fans had come to love. But there's so much more to this season than what you see on screen. The stories behind the stories are just as compelling as the show itself, and tonight we are going to walk through all of them at a pace that's perfect for winding down and drifting off. Let's start with the most talked about element of Season 3, which is the introduction of Herogasm. Now, even if you haven't seen the show, you've probably heard people mention this episode. Herogasm is originally a storyline from the comic books written by Garth Ennis, and for years fans wondered whether the show would ever actually adapt it. When showrunner Eric Kripke and his team finally decided to go for it, they committed completely. The episode titled Herogasm became one of the most discussed and dissected episodes of television in 2022. What's genuinely fascinating is that the production team made a very deliberate and thoughtful decision to approach the content in a way that felt purposeful rather than gratuitous. Kripke talked openly about how they wanted the scene to serve the story and the characters rather than exist purely for shock value. The Homelander versus Soldier Boy versus Butcher confrontation that takes place during that episode is genuinely one of the most intense fight sequences the show has ever produced. Speaking of Soldier Boy, the casting of Jensen Ackles in that role deserves its own conversation. Jensen Ackles spent 15 years playing Dean Winchester on Supernatural, a show that Eric Kripke himself created. So when it came time to cast Soldier Boy, a character who is essentially a toxic, narcissistic, deeply dangerous version of a classic American superhero, Kripke knew exactly who he wanted. There's something beautifully layered about taking an actor who became famous for playing a beloved hero and giving him a role that systematically deconstructs the very idea of heroism. Jensen Ackles threw himself into the part with remarkable dedication. He spent months preparing physically and vocally to embody the character, and the result is a performance that manages to be simultaneously magnetic and genuinely unsettling. The character of Soldier Boy is deeply rooted in American mythology. He's presented as the original superhero, a figure from World War II who became a symbol of American power and exceptionalism. But as Season 3 reveals, almost everything about his legendary status is manufactured. The show uses him as a way to comment on how societies construct heroes, and how those constructions often have nothing to do with the actual people they supposedly represent. Soldier Boy didn't earn his reputation through genuine heroism. He earned it through propaganda, through corporate storytelling, and through the willingness of powerful institutions to promote a useful image regardless of the truth. That's a theme that runs through the entire show, but Season 3 makes it more explicit and more personal than ever before. Now let's talk about the research and development that goes into making this season feel so textured and real despite all its over-the-top elements. The writer's room for The Boys is known for doing extensive research into corporate culture, political messaging, social media dynamics, and the history of celebrity. For Season 3, they dug particularly deep into the mechanics of fascism, propaganda, and the psychology of charismatic authoritarian figures. The way Homelander's arc develops throughout the season is clearly informed by real-world examples of populist leaders who cultivate devoted followings through emotional manipulation and the constant performance of victimhood. Anthony Starr, who plays Homelander, has spoken in interviews about how he studied various historical and contemporary figures to understand the psychological makeup of someone like that. Anthony Starr's performance in Season 3 is widely considered to be one of the finest acting achievements in the entire run of the show. He finds new layers in Homelander that feel genuinely surprising even for viewers who thought they understood the character completely. The scene where Homelander stands on top of a building and is cheered by a crowd after committing an act of open violence is one of the most disturbing and thought-provoking moments in the season. It's disturbing precisely because it feels believable. It doesn't feel like science fiction or exaggeration. It feels like a logical extension of things we've actually seen happen in the real world. The writers and star worked very carefully together to build that moment properly across multiple episodes so that when it lands, it hits with maximum impact. Now let's drift a little softer, because we're talking about sleep content here and I want to make sure you're settling in nicely. Just take a breath. Let your shoulders drop. The facts we are discussing are interesting, but there's no urgency here. Just let the information float around you gently as you get more comfortable. The production design of Season 3 is extraordinary, and it's something that often gets overlooked in favor of discussing the performances and the storylines. The visual language of the show evolved significantly this season. The Seven's boardroom, Vought Tower, the various locations tied to the history of Compound V, all of these spaces were designed with incredible attention to detail. The art department embedded visual references and symbolic imagery throughout the season that reward close attention. If you've ever paused on certain frames and noticed something unexpected in the background, that's completely intentional. The production designers have talked about how they treat the visual world of the boys like a layer of storytelling that exists independent of the dialogue and action. The costumes in Season 3 are another area where an enormous amount of thought went into every decision. The superhero suits are obviously spectacular and technically demanding, but the civilian clothing is where the costume department gets to do some of their most interesting character work. The way Billy Butcher dresses, for instance, tells you a huge amount about his psychology and his sense of self. The way Homelander's costume has evolved subtly across the seasons reflects his character arc. These aren't accidents. The costume designers work closely with the writers and directors to make sure that what characters wear is reinforcing what the scripts and performances are communicating. Let's talk about the comedy in Season 3 for a moment, because this show does something genuinely difficult, which is balance brutal violence and heavy thematic content with genuinely funny humor. The character of Frenchie, played by Toma Capone, and the character of Kimiko, played by Karen Fukuhara, got a musical number in Season 3 that became one of the most beloved and unexpected moments in the show's history. The sequence, set to a well-known song, is completely absurd and completely charming, and it works because the show has earned the emotional investment in these two characters over multiple seasons. You care about Frenchie and Kimiko deeply by the time that moment arrives, so when it happens, it genuinely delights you rather than feeling like a tonal mistake. Karen Fukuhara has spoken about how much preparation went into that sequence and how meaningful it was for her character's arc. Kimiko is a character who was robbed of her voice in a very literal sense, and the musical number is a fantasy sequence that represents her inner life in a way that the show hadn't been able to access before. It's a genuinely creative storytelling choice that shows the depth of commitment the writers have to every character in the ensemble, not just the headliners. The relationship between Butcher and Huey in Season 3 undergoes some of its most significant development yet. Carl Urban and Jack Quaid have remarkable chemistry that has been one of the show's secret weapons since the beginning, but this season their dynamic gets genuinely complicated in ways that feel emotionally honest. Both characters make choices that are hard to justify and hard to forgive, and the show doesn't ask you to simply understand or excuse those choices. It asks you to sit with the complexity and keep watching. That's a mature approach to storytelling that respects the audience's intelligence and emotional capacity. Jack Quaid, who plays Huey, is the son of Dennis Quaid and Meg Ryan, which is a piece of trivia that never stops being interesting. He came to The Boys as a relatively unknown actor and has used the show as a platform to develop into someone with genuine range and presence. His journey in Season 3 involves experimenting with Compound V to gain temporary powers, and the show uses that storyline to explore questions about masculinity, self-worth, and the dangerous seductiveness of power. Huey wants to feel capable and relevant and strong, and the show is compassionate about that desire while also being clear-eyed about the costs of pursuing power through shortcuts. Now let's ease back a little more. You've been listening for a while now, and hopefully your body is getting heavier and your thoughts are starting to slow down. We're going to keep going, nice and steady, through more of these fascinating details. Just let the words carry you along without holding onto anything too tightly. One of the most technically impressive aspects of Season 3 is the action choreography and the visual effects work. The fight sequences in this season are more elaborate and more viscerally impactful than anything the show had done before. The confrontation at Heragasm and the various battles involving Soldier Boy required months of pre-production planning and collaboration between the stunt team, the visual effects department, and the directors. The show works with a rotating group of directors rather than a single consistent voice, which is a model that requires exceptional coordination. Each director brings their own aesthetic sensibilities to their episodes, but the overall visual consistency is maintained through the work of the producers and the director of photography. The visual effects team on The Boys Season 3 did something genuinely interesting with Soldier Boy's power set. His ability, which involves releasing a powerful energy blast that can suppress other suits' powers, required building a whole new visual language that had to feel distinct from the other powers in the show while still fitting within the established aesthetic. The team drew inspiration from various sources including vintage comic book imagery and Cold War-era nuclear imagery to give his power a specific historical texture. Eric Kripke's role as showrunner deserves special attention because his vision and his voice are what give the show its particular character. Kripke is known for being deeply involved in every aspect of the creative process while also being genuinely collaborative with his writers, directors, and actors. He talks openly about the political intentions of the show and doesn't shy away from being specific about what he's responding to in contemporary culture. This willingness to be direct about the show's satirical targets is somewhat unusual in Hollywood, where projects are often packaged in ambiguity to avoid alienating any potential audience segment. Kripke has made a deliberate choice to be clear about what The Boys is saying and to trust that the audience will be receptive to that kind of directness. The show's handling of social media and online celebrity culture in Season 3 is particularly sharp. A-Train's storyline this season involves themes of racial identity and the instrumentalization of social justice messaging for personal and corporate gain. This is a storyline that required careful and thoughtful handling, and the writers worked hard to make sure it felt genuinely considered rather than superficial. The show doesn't offer easy answers about A-Train or his choices. It presents the contradictions and lets the audience wrestle with them. Jesse T. Usher, who plays A-Train, has spoken about how much the storyline meant to him personally and how he worked closely with the writers to make sure the character's perspective felt authentic. The deep storyline in Season 3 continues to develop in directions that are equal parts comedic and genuinely uncomfortable. Chase Crawford plays the deep with a specific kind of pathetic energy that is really difficult to pull off without becoming cartoonish. The character is simultaneously a predator, a coward, a comic figure, and occasionally someone who seems capable of genuine feeling. The show uses him as a way to explore how institutions protect and enable bad actors, how sycophancy and ambition corrupt people, and how the desperate need for approval can lead someone to do things they might otherwise consider unconscionable. Let's talk about the Black Noir storyline in Season 3 because it goes to some surprising and genuinely poignant places. The character, who had been largely mysterious for the first 2 seasons, gets more interiority this season through flashback sequences that use an interesting stylistic choice involving cartoon characters to represent his inner life. This was a creative decision that could easily have felt gimmicky but instead lands with real emotional weight. The reveal of Black Noir's backstory and his relationship to Soldier Boy adds a new dimension to both characters that recontextualizes things you thought you already understood. Nathan Mitchell, who plays Black Noir, is a physically imposing presence who conveys enormous amounts of emotion through body language alone, which is genuinely demanding work given that the character almost never removes the mask. He has spoken about the challenges and the rewards of performing in a way that relies entirely on physical expression rather than facial expression, and Season 3 gave him some of his most demanding and rewarding material yet. As you're listening to this, hopefully your breathing has slowed down a little. The room is quiet around you. These details about the boys are interesting, but they don't require anything from you right now. You can just let them drift past, catching the ones that interest you, letting the others go. Season 3 of The Boys is 8 episodes long, which is a length that the production team has consistently used across all 3 seasons. This consistency is deliberate. Kripke has talked about his preference for tight, focused seasons that don't allow the narrative to become bloated or repetitive. Each episode in Season 3 runs roughly between 45 and 65 minutes, giving each installment room to breathe while maintaining momentum. The pacing within individual episodes is carefully controlled to balance action, character work, comedy, and thematic content in proportions that feel natural rather than mechanical. The music in The Boys Season 3 is another area where the show does exceptional work. The music supervisor makes choices that are surprising and specific rather than reaching for obvious or safe selections. The way songs are deployed in the show often creates meaning through contrast or irony, placing upbeat or familiar music against images and actions that create a dissonance that's both funny and unsettling. This technique has been used memorably across the entire series, but Season 3 finds new variations on it that feel fresh. The show films primarily in Toronto, Canada, which serves as a convincing stand-in for various American locations. The production team has become expert at transforming Toronto's streets and architecture into environments that feel authentically American while taking advantage of Canadian production resources. This is a common practice in television and film production, but The Boys does it particularly effectively, and regular Toronto residents have noted the experience of recognizing local landmarks dressed up as fictional American locations. One of the most discussed aspects of Season 3 is its political satire, and the question of how directly the show is commenting on specific real-world figures and events. The showrunners and writers have been fairly open about their general targets without being so specific that the show becomes a series of one-to-one allegories. The genius of the satire is that it's specific enough to be pointed but broad enough to have resonance beyond any particular moment. This is actually harder to achieve than it sounds. Satire that's too specific becomes dated quickly. Satire that's too general loses its teeth. The Boys threads that needle with notable skill. The casting process for Season 3, particularly for Soldier Boy, involved extensive conversations about what the character needed to accomplish and what kind of actor could bring the necessary combination of physical presence, comedic timing, dramatic weight, and cultural meaning to the role. Jensen Ackles checks all of those boxes and then some. What's particularly interesting is that his character exists in a kind of generational dialogue with Homelander throughout the season. They're both products of Vaught's manufacturing process. They're both performers of a certain kind of American masculinity. But they come from different eras and different templates, and that generational gap between them is one of the richest dramatic tensions the season explores. The writers of The Boys have a background in various genres and traditions, and that diversity of influence shows in the texture of the writing. There are elements of horror, action cinema, political thriller, black comedy, and character drama all operating simultaneously. Managing all of those registers without any of them overwhelming the others is a genuine craft achievement, and Season 3 is probably the best example of the show operating at peak capacity across all of those modes at once. Let's take another gentle pause here. You're doing great. Just breathe. The night is quiet and still, and there's nothing you need to do right now except rest. Let these interesting facts about this fascinating show continue to drift over you as your mind becomes quieter. Erin Moriarty, who plays Annie January, also known as Starlight, has one of the most demanding arcs in Season 3. Her character is at the center of some of the season's most emotionally intense moments as she navigates her relationship with Huey, her position within the Seven, and her own evolving sense of identity and purpose. Moriarty has spoken about the physical and emotional demands of the season, and about working closely with the directors and writers to make sure Annie's journey felt internally consistent and emotionally real. Her performance is remarkable for its combination of warmth, vulnerability, and genuine ferocity. The show's approach to violence is something that comes up frequently in discussions about what The Boys is doing aesthetically and ethically. The violence in the show is graphic and it's meant to be uncomfortable. The creative team has been consistent in explaining that they want the violence to have weight and consequence rather than being the kind of bloodless, sanitized violence that dominates most superhero content. By making the violence feel real and costly, the show forces the audience to think about what they're watching in a way that's genuinely useful for the show's thematic purposes. You can't watch The Boys and find the violence entertaining in a simple, uncomplicated way. It always comes with a cost. The relationship between the boys and the superhero genre more broadly is a genuinely complex one. The show clearly loves superhero stories even as it systematically deconstructs them. Many of the creators and cast members are fans of the genre who see The Boys as a way of engaging with it critically rather than dismissing it. There's a difference between hating something and caring enough about it to examine its assumptions and contradictions. The Boys falls firmly in the latter category, and that genuine engagement with the genre is part of what gives the show its energy and its affection. The production schedule for The Boys Season 3 was complicated by the ongoing effects of the global pandemic, which had disrupted production across the television and film industry. The team adapted to the challenges with considerable flexibility and creativity, and the final product shows no visible evidence of the difficulties they faced. This is a testament to the professionalism and dedication of everyone involved in the production, from the writers and directors to the crew members who made it happen on a practical level every single day. Let's talk for a moment about the fan response to Season 3, because it's genuinely interesting to observe how the audience engaged with the most provocative elements. The Harrigasm episode was watched and discussed by enormous numbers of people who had perhaps been casual fans before and became deeply invested viewers after experiencing what the show was willing to do. The internet response to that episode was a kind of cultural event in itself, with commentary coming from people across the entertainment industry, media, and general public. The showrunners had anticipated a strong reaction, but the scale of the conversation surprised even them. The show's use of social media as part of its promotional strategy has been particularly clever. The Vought International account, which presents itself as though it's the real social media presence of the fictional corporation from the show, has become a beloved part of the fan experience. The content posted on these accounts extends the world of the show into real social media spaces in a way that's both funny and thought-provoking, given that the show is partly about the power of social media and corporate messaging. It's the show practicing what it preaches in a way that demonstrates genuine self-awareness. The critical response to Season 3 was overwhelmingly positive, with particular praise directed at the performances, the writing, and the show's willingness to continue taking risks rather than settling into a comfortable formula. Shows that make it to a third season often become more cautious as they try to protect what they've built, but The Boys actually became more ambitious and more confident with each passing season. That's a pattern that's relatively rare in television, and it's worth noting as one of the show's significant achievements. One particularly interesting behind-the-scenes detail from Season 3 involves the writing of the Homelander storyline. The writers have described the process of mapping out his arc as requiring them to constantly think about real-world historical examples of how charismatic but dangerous figures build and maintain power. They read extensively in history and political science to understand the mechanics of what Homelander is doing, which is why his manipulation of public sentiment feels so disturbingly credible. Anthony Starr then took that research and grounded it in an incredibly specific, technically precise performance that never tips over into caricature. The Boys exists in a tradition of satirical fiction that includes everything from Network to DR. Strangelove to Don't Look Up, works that use exaggeration and dark humor to illuminate uncomfortable truths about how power operates and how ordinary people respond to it. What makes The Boys distinctive within that tradition is the combination of its mainstream appeal, its superhero trappings, and its genuine emotional depth. It reaches people who might not normally engage with explicitly political satire because it wraps its arguments in an enormously entertaining package. You're still here, which is wonderful. Hopefully you're quite relaxed by now, maybe drifting a little. That's perfectly fine. Just let the last few details wash over you gently as we wind down this conversation about a show that has so much more going on beneath its spectacular surface. The character of Victoria Newman, played by Claudia Dumet, becomes even more important in Season 3 as her true allegiances and capabilities become clearer. The character is a brilliantly constructed piece of satire about political ambition and the way institutions protect people who are useful to them regardless of what those people have done. Dumet brings a specific kind of controlled intensity to the role that makes Newman consistently compelling even when the character is doing things that are difficult to watch. The show's writers have consistently said that they want the show to be genuinely funny as well as genuinely disturbing, and Season 3 achieves that balance probably better than any previous season. The comedy never undercuts the drama, and the drama never makes the comedy feel inappropriate. They exist simultaneously because that's how life actually works. The most intense and the most absurd things can occupy the same moment, and the ability to reflect that truth is one of the markers of genuinely sophisticated storytelling. As we draw close to the end of tonight's journey through the fascinating details of The Boys Season 3, I want to leave you with something to think about as you drift off into sleep. The show is ultimately about accountability and the absence of it. It's about what happens when power is allowed to operate without consequences, when the stories we tell about strength and heroism are manufactured rather than earned, and when ordinary people try to find ways to hold extraordinary power responsible. Those are questions that have always mattered and will always matter, which is why the show resonates so deeply with so many people. The craft and care that went into Season 3, from the performances to the writing to the visual effects to the production design, represents a remarkable collective achievement. Television is a collaborative medium, and The Boys is one of the best recent examples of what's possible when talented people work together with genuine ambition and genuine respect for their audience. So let that be where we leave things tonight. The lights are low. The information has settled around you like something soft and familiar. You know a little more now about how one of television's most interesting shows was made and what it was trying to do. And there's nothing left for you to do tonight except let your thoughts grow quieter and your breathing grow slower and let the rest of the night carry you somewhere peaceful. Sleep well. You've earned it.